Have you ever stopped, really stopped in the absolute quiet of an empty room and just looked at the scaffolding of your own mind?
Yeah, that's a terrifying thing to do, honestly.
It really is. I'm talking about the beliefs you hold most dear, like the morals you fiercely defend, or the specific things you confidently label as inherently good or, definitively true.
Right. The absolute certainties.
Exactly. We tend to build our entire lives on these massive, invisible pillars, and we walk around with this quiet, unquestioned assumption that they are made of solid, unyielding marble.
Hmm.
But what if you were to take a chisel to that marble and you strike it and you discover that it wasn't marble at all?
Oh, wow.
What if it was just packed dirt? Like ancient dust, primal fears, and old evolutionary mistakes, all hardened only by the sheer passage of time.
That is, well, it's a profound and intensely quiet dismantling, isn't it?
It is. And today we are inviting you to take a chisel to the very foundation of how you think, feel, and judge the world around you.
Because we are looking at a text that asks us not merely to question the answers we have arrived at, but to radically and frankly uncomfortably question our most revered questions.
Yes. The book we are examining is Human, All Too Human by Friedrich Nietzsche.
And, we're really being asked here to look at the literal mechanical chemistry of our highest human ideals.
Right. But to really grasp the mechanics of what this book is attempting to do, we have to understand the deeply physical and psychological rupture from which it emerged. It's not just some academic exercise.
Far from it. I mean, to understand this book, you really must understand the profound silence, the physical pain, and the ultimate isolation that forged it.
The physical pain was severe, wasn't it?
It was devastating. This work represents a massive seismic shift for the author. It was written during a period of just severe, debilitating physical illness. He was suffering from these agonizing migraines, near blindness, relentless nausea.
Wow.
Yeah, conditions so severe they actually compelled him to completely abandon his prestigious academic duties.
So he's basically totally isolated in his suffering.
Exactly. But
Right.
the sickness wasn't just physical. It acted as a catalyst for a violent intellectual break from his past idols. He was completely, utterly severing his philosophical ties with German Romanticism.
Okay, let's unpack this, because that severance is really the engine of the whole text.
Right.
German Romanticism at its core was this obsession with sublime nature, high overwhelming emotion, divine intuition, and this almost mystical belief in the genius who could access higher truth.
Yes, the grand, intoxicating idea.
Exactly. So breaking from that means pivoting away from all the grandiose stuff and moving towards something much colder.
Precisely. It's a pivot to cold, hard, unsentimental observation. Because of this profound disillusionment, the book just completely abandons the heavy, systematic philosophy that was so popular at the time.
No more giant castles of thought.
Right, no more towering, rigid structures with neat, interconnected rooms. Instead, the author delivers his analysis in short, piercing aphorisms.
Just these quick flashes.
Quick, sudden flashes of observation. Because the logic is that any grand, closed philosophical system is inherently dishonest.
Yeah.
I mean, human reality is just too messy to fit into a perfect framework.
It's too chaotic. So the mission then is to navigate these flashes of observation to see how our grandest ideals, the beautiful, altruistic, noble things that we think make us distinctly magnificent, might actually be rooted in the most basic, undeniable, and entirely undivine human errors.
Yes.
But the argument begins with an important prerequisite. Before you can analyze the world objectively, you have to forge a mind capable of that analysis.
You need the right tool.
Right. So the book introduces the concept of the free spirit. And this is not some romanticized bohemian state of mind.
Not at all.
It is forged in a violent, deeply painful process described as the Great Liberation.
And that great liberation is depicted not as a gentle awakening, but literally as an earthquake.
An earthquake.
The young soul is suddenly shaken and torn apart. You are violently pulled away from your sense of duty, from your comforting traditions, and from everything you previously revered.
It sounds terrifying.
It is. The text describes it as a sudden dread and distrust of the very things you loved.
The analogy that comes to mind here, and tell me if this tracks, it's like a uniquely modern kind of crisis.
Okay.
Imagine waking up one morning, perhaps you're in your late 40s. You put on the suit you have worn for decades. You look in the mirror, and suddenly, with terrifying, paralyzing clarity, you realize that your entire lifelong career is entirely hollow.
Wow, yeah. Or a deeply held religious belief system you were raised in.
Exactly. The entire architecture of your identity just collapses. But the text describes this initial freedom as a malady, a sickness where the person roves fiercely around, cynically tearing everything to pieces.
Right.
Why is this initial stage of freedom diagnosed as a disease? Like, why is it a sickness to finally see the truth?
Well, it's a malady because this initial outbreak of strength is entirely unguided. It's reactionary.
Yeah. Ah, okay.
It's an intoxicating, willful, almost volcanic longing. When those heavy chains of tradition snap, the immediate psychological reaction is not serene peace.
You don't just become zen.
Exactly, you don't. It's a dangerous, restless curiosity. The person looks at whatever they used to hold in reverential awe and just feels this burning need to overturn it, simply to see what it looks like upside down.
Just to break it.
Yeah. They ask terrifying, destabilizing questions like, what if good is actually just a sophisticated form of evil? What if morality is just a mechanism of social control?
That's a dark place to be.
Very dark. This dangerous curiosity is a necessary trial, though. It's a morbid solitude that isolates you from everyone who is still sleeping in their comforting illusions. But, and this is key, you cannot stay in that state of cynical destruction.
Because it'll destroy you.
If you do, the sickness entirely consumes you.
Which brings us to this incredibly vivid imagery of the convalescent.
Yes, the healing phase.
Right. After this raging fever of cynicism, there are long years of quiet healing. The text paints this picture of someone recovering from a devastating illness, just sitting humbly in the sun, almost like a lizard basking on a warm wall.
I love that image. Just a lizard on a wall.
It's so striking. It's a deliberate move away from the aggressive tearing down of the malady. In this state of convalescence, the free spirit learns a profound, quiet humility. They learn to view their own virtues, their own drives, not as masters that command their identity, but merely as tools in their hands. The ultimate goal is gaining absolute conscious power over your own yes and your own no.
And that mastery over one's own affirmations and denials, that is the true mark of the free spirit.
Right.
So once this mind is awake, having survived the earthquake and the fever,
Right.
and is now sitting quietly in the sun with this new detached perspective, it turns its gaze toward the history of human values.
It starts looking at the world.
Yes. And here, the book introduces a vital analytical tool,
Mm-hmm.
the chemistry of the notions and the feelings.
Chemistry. I love that phrasing. And this chemistry targets a fundamental, almost universal error made by traditional philosophers.
It does.
The text argues that throughout history, philosophers have looked at modern man and assumed he is an eternal truth, an eterna veritas.
Right, and this is a crucial mechanical failure in human reasoning. Traditional philosophy looks at our current intellect, our complex morals, and our sophisticated instincts, and just treats them as fixed, unchanging standards that have existed from the dawn of time.
Like they just dropped out of the sky.
Exactly. It's the equivalent of looking at a modern, towering skyscraper and assuming it's spontaneously generated from the earth.
Completely ignoring the process.
Completely ignoring the slow, grinding process of architecture, engineering, and raw material extraction. Metaphysics, in particular, falls victim to this.
How so?
Well, it looks at our highest, most noble attributes, like pure altruism, selfless love, or the pursuit of absolute truth, and insists they could not possibly have evolved from our lower, animalistic nature.
It's too pretty to come from dirt.
Right. Therefore, metaphysics assigns a miraculous, divine origin to what it deems highest and best.
So it sets up a false dichotomy. It claims that a noble thing cannot be born from a base thing.
Exactly.
But the scientific method, this rigorous chemistry of morals the book proposes, takes the exact opposite approach. It applies the cold, unfeeling laws of chemical decomposition to human emotion, and it reveals that these magnificent, soaring ethical results are actually forged from the basest, most despised ingredients.
It's all just raw materials.
Right. Like the seemingly noble act of charity breaks down under this chemistry into an evolved form of egoism, perhaps a desire for social power or just a mechanism to alleviate the internal discomfort we feel when witnessing pain.
What's fascinating here is that the distillation process proved there is no magical separation between the divine and the animal.
They're on the same continuum.
Exactly. The highest human behaviors are just lower animal instincts that have been sublimated, refined, and redirected over thousands of years.
It is an unsettling thought, though, to realize that the foundations of human goodness might be entirely self-serving.
It definitely shakes people.
It's often compared to looking at a dazzling diamond and realizing it's just crushed coal. But I actually want to push past that cliche.
Okay.
Think of it more like looking at the underlying code of a beautiful, highly functioning software program.
Oh, I like that.
You see this gorgeous user interface, but then you look at the source code and you realize it's built on thousands of lines of incredibly selfish, primitive logic loops meant only to ensure the program's survival.
Right, it's just raw, survival-driven math underneath.
Exactly. But here's my question. Does understanding the chemical or algorithmic breakdown of our morals destroy their utility?
Well, the text argues forcefully that it does not destroy their utility, but it absolutely does strip away their intoxicating mystique.
Magic is gone.
The magic is gone. It champions what it calls little simple truths. These are the hard-won, rigorous, often unglamorous truths ascertained by strict scientific method. The book demands that we value these rigid, homely, prosaic truths infinitely more than the pleasing, magnificent, intoxicating errors of metaphysics.
Even if they're ugly.
Even if they're ugly. The traditionalists, the reverers of ancient mystical forms, they might laugh at this cold science, entirely missing its simple, rational beauty. But there is a profound hypothetical posed here.
What's that?
Even if a metaphysical world exists, even if there is some divine thing in itself operating behind the curtain of our physical reality, it would be utterly useless to us.
Wow. And the analogy the book uses here is so striking.
The sailor.
Yes, the drowning sailor. Knowing about a metaphysical realm would be as profoundly useless as knowing the chemical formula of water is to a sailor actively drowning in a violent storm.
Okay.
Knowing that water is 2 parts hydrogen and 1 part oxygen does not help you swim. It does not provide buoyancy.
That doesn't save you.
It doesn't save you.
Yeah.
Similarly, waiting for divine metaphysical salvation does not help you navigate the brutal, immediate realities of human existence.
It forces a return to the physical, historical world.
Yes.
But, if these grand divine origins of morality are just intoxicating errors, it really begs the question of how an entire species bought into the illusion so completely.
How did we all get tricked?
Exactly. How did we build a global civilization on top of these fundamental chemical mistakes? To explain this monumental deception, the book points to 2 incredibly everyday phenomena that shaped the primitive mind.
Okay.
Language and dreams.
Language and dreams. Let's start with language. If language is the tool we use to consciously build our reality, the text suggests it is a tool with a massive inherent flaw.
A huge bug in the software.
Right. Early humans genuinely believed that by giving names to things, they possessed ultimate wisdom over them. When they created a word, they believed they were capturing an eternal, immutable truth. But the mechanism of language requires a massive oversimplification of reality.
Exactly. Think about how we use words. When early humans used the same word to describe 2 different objects, say 2 leaves on a tree, they implicitly assumed those objects were identical.
Because they share a name.
Right. They created the concept of leaf. But in reality, in the physical, tangible world, there are no perfect duplicates.
Not a single one.
No 2 leaves are exactly the same. There are no perfectly straight lines in nature, no true circles. Nature is chaotic and infinitely variable.
But we act like it's uniform.
Yes. Yet, logic, mathematics, and our entire framework of reasoning rest entirely upon the primitive false assumption that identical things exist. The early language builder essentially placed a simplified, rigid world of concepts alongside the chaotic real world, and used this conceptual world as a lever to try and master the cosmos.
And we are still trapped in that conceptual matrix today.
We absolutely are.
We took a heuristic, a mental shortcut necessary for basic communication, and we mistook it for the fundamental architecture of the universe. And if language forces us into errors of identicals while we are awake, the text suggests our sleeping minds offer an even starker look at this primitive machinery.
The dream theory in this book is just phenomenal.
It's a masterpiece of psychological deduction. It argues that during sleep, the functioning of our brain, specifically our complex memory and higher reasoning, is drastically reduced.
It powers down.
Right. It is forced backward into a tangled, primitive state.
The mechanism described is so fascinating. Just imagine you are sleeping and your body experiences a very real, minor physical sensation.
Okay.
Let's say your feet get tightly tangled in your blankets, restricting your movement.
A very common thing.
Right. The sleeping brain receives this physical agitation. But because the higher logical processing centers are turned off, the primitive brain wildly and instantly invents a narrative cause to explain the physical feeling.
It needs a story.
It desperately needs a story. So instead of rationally deducing, oh, my feet are tangled in cotton fabric, the dreaming mind searches its primitive database of fears and conjures up an image of two coiled serpents wrapped around your ankles.
Wow.
It experiences an effect, the physical restriction, and rapidly, illogically invents a cause, the serpents.
It is essentially an ancient, flawed algorithm. We trained our neural networks on terrible, terrifying early human data.
Where every rustle in the bushes had to be interpreted as a predator just to keep us alive.
Exactly. And the text connects this directly to how humanity functioned for millennia. This flawed, upside-down dream logic, experiencing an effect and wildly inventing a mythical cause, is exactly how early humanity reasoned while they were wide awake.
Yes, waking dreamers.
They experienced the terrifying, unpredictable effects of nature-devastating storms, sudden plagues, inexplicable deaths, and just like the dreaming brain, they frantically invented narrative causes to explain the nervous excitations of the world.
They invented vengeful gods.
They invented gods, they invented elaborate myths, and they invented the concept of free will to make sense of human behavior.
We literally relive the primitive, savage age of mankind every single time our head hits the pillow.
That is so wild to think about.
And this primitive algorithm is still running in the background of our waking lives.
Okay.
We are constantly superimposing complex, rational narratives over basic physical sensations.
You see this play out in everyday life constantly.
Oh, all the time.
Think about how often you find yourself in a state of deep existential dread or profound anger. Your brain immediately starts building a logical narrative case for why you were angry. You decide that your career is a failure, that society is fundamentally unjust, that your relationships are irreparably broken. You invent this massive, complex philosophical cause.
And in reality,
When in reality, the actual physical cause is simply that you only slept 4 hours, your blood sugar is crashing, and your body is physically stressed.
we are still assigning serpents to tangled blankets.
Exactly. We walk around in a waking dream of false causes, entirely unaware of the chemical and physical realities actually driving our moods.
We are indeed heavily burdened by these inherited habits of our ancestors. Our operating system is fundamentally out of date.
It really is.
And this brings the philosophical progression of the book right into the modern era, into what it defines as the age of comparison.
The age of comparison, because we are slowly, painfully shaking off these metaphysical errors, we find ourselves in a unique historical position.
Right. We no longer have a single, unquestioned, monolithic tradition ruling over us with absolute authority.
There's no one overarching story anymore.
Exactly. Through history, science, and global awareness, we can now look at all moralities, all religious customs, and all cultures side by side. We can compare them.
We can see the chemical breakdown of every society's highest ideals.
Yes. And the text describes this era as intellectually glorious, but also deeply existentially painful.
Why painful?
Because when you strip away the eternal metaphysical foundations of human action, you lose a crucial psychological driver.
The motivation changes.
Completely. In the past, when people genuinely believed their souls were immortal and that their earthly actions echoed permanently in a divine eternity, they were driven to build eternal monuments. They spent centuries constructing massive cathedrals they would never see finished. They planted forests of oak trees they would never sit under, sacrificing their present moment for future eternal generations.
But in the age of comparison, that specific mechanism of motivation completely breaks down.
It vanishes.
If we know that our perspectives are shaped merely by physical chemistry, evolutionary biology, and random historical accidents, the drive to build for eternity just vanishes.
Why build the cathedral?
Exactly. Why spend a lifetime dragging stones for a cathedral if you know the god it honors is simply an ancient linguistic error born from dream logic.
Right.
Consequently, individuals begin to focus entirely on their own short, fleeting, intensely physical lives. They want to gather the fruit from the tree immediately because there is no eternity waiting for them.
And this is the precipice of nihilism.
It sounds like it.
I mean, if every grand feeling is just an evolved chemical response, and every deeply held belief is just a waking dream of false causes, the logical conclusion seems to be absolute despair.
Just complete emptiness.
But the text absolutely does not leave us to freeze in that cold realization. It outlines a path forward, a highly specific vision of profound tranquility.
The transition from total chemical deconstruction to tranquility is, well, I think it's the most delicate maneuver in the entire framework.
It is a tightrope walk.
How does realizing that your life is built on ancient errors lead to peace instead of depression? It seems it requires a massive recalibration of how we view purpose.
It requires a gentle, cheerful, and incredibly fortified temperament. The psychological mechanism of this liberation works precisely because the weight of eternity is removed.
So the burden is lifted.
Think about the exhausting nature of living under traditional morality. You are constantly striving for a perfection that doesn't exist. You're constantly feeling guilt for failing to meet divine standards.
Constantly judging your neighbors based on absolute laws.
Yes, it is a strenuous, angry, highly competitive drive. The book suggests that by deeply accepting that our lives are inextricably involved in untruth, we can actually let go of that crushing burden.
It is the realization that you don't have to be a crusader.
Exactly.
When you fully internalize that the traditional estimates of honor, societal praise, and moral reproach are based on nothing more than ancient inherited errors and biological impulses, they lose their power over you.
They just evaporate.
You no longer have to be ruled by the desperate need to align with them or the angry need to destroy them. You can simply live.
You soar above the heavy moralistic judgments of the world. You act almost as a peaceful spectator.
A spectator.
Yeah, you can walk through the chaotic marketplace of society without the agonizing burden of having to condemn it or worship it. You understand the chemistry of the people screaming around you.
Because you see the gears turning.
Exactly. It is a liberation through resignation. You find a quiet, enduring joy in simply growing in knowledge, observing the great, flawed, deeply illogical play of humanity without anger or expectation.
Wow. It leaves us sitting with a profound, almost overwhelming paradox regarding the human condition.
It really does.
The very errors, the delusions, the wildly illogical dream states and false causes that mankind has operated under for thousands of years. Those are exactly the things that made humans deep.
They were the necessary ingredients.
The terror of the metaphysical, the striving for the impossible, the passionate belief in absolute truth, these were the mechanisms that made us sensitive. They were the rich, complex soil that grew profound art, intense romantic love, and soaring architecture. The delusion was the necessary fertilizer for our greatest, most magnificent human achievement.
Which forces us to confront an ultimate, deeply unsettling question after unearthing all of these foundations.
Yeah.
If our most beautiful, soaring, deeply touching human qualities required a bedrock of illogical error and blind, passionate untruth to evolve, what would happen if we actually succeeded in our modern scientific pursuit? What if we eventually stripped away every illusion, every false cause, and built a purely logical, scientifically transparent, entirely error-free society? Would we finally reach the perfection we have always dreamed of, or would we simply cease to be human?
And to actually wield that surgeon's scalpel effectively, we really have to revive this almost forgotten practice of psychological observation. I mean, as we dive into part 2 of our journey here, you have to imagine a surgeon handing you that scalpel, but instead of cutting into flesh, they ask you to slice into your most cherished beliefs about your own goodness.
Right. And that is exactly the freezing atmosphere we have to step into right now as we continue this rigorous dissection of the book's philosophy.
Yeah, because the book looks at our current era and diagnoses this profound, almost tragic poverty of self-awareness. Like in former centuries, sitting around and meticulously dissecting human motives, peeling back the layers to examine the raw machinery of why people do what they do, that was actually considered a high art form.
That was a vital tool.
Exactly, a tool that made the heavy burden of life lighter.
Right. It provided entertainment even in the most wearisome environments.
Yeah.
You could cull maxims in the thorniest paths of life and find yourself invigorated by just the sheer clarity of understanding human behavior.
But today, we talk constantly about society, about public figures, about nations, but we say absolutely nothing about the fundamental nature of man himself.
And we have to consider why that art was lost. I mean, the argument presented is that humanity has developed a blind faith in its own inherent goodness. We possess this profound shamefacedness at the nakedness of the soul.
We would much rather believe in disinterested benevolence because it makes us feel secure, right? It pads the sharp edges of reality.
Exactly. The book compares great psychological thinkers, specifically the French masters, to expert marksmen. They raise their rifles, they take aim, and time after time they hit the black spot.
And that black spot is located squarely within human nature.
Right. But when observers watch this display today, instead of admiring the scientific precision of the marksman, they curse the art itself out of this misplaced humanitarian feeling. They view this meticulous observation as a practice that merely belittles and impeaches mankind rather than illuminating it.
They curse it because the truth feels like a physical assault. To navigate this, you need a highly specific, almost clinical mental posture. The book explicitly mentions the knife and tweezers required for this process.
Which is an incredibly visceral image.
It is. When a surgeon cuts into an infection, the act looks repulsive. It feels incredibly cold to the touch. But if you are suffering from a deep, festering disease of illusion, which the book argues we all are, that scalpel is the only logical way to dissect the malady and remove it.
Older philosophies relied on paltry evasions. They built these mythological monstrosities to explain away human behavior so we wouldn't have to look at our own selfishness.
Right, so if you are going to understand the true origin of your moral feelings, you have to prepare yourself for the icy air. You must be willing to step into an atmosphere that is cold-cutting and profoundly wintry.
Which means the very first illusion that must be excised by the scalpel is discretionary freedom, what we commonly call free will.
That is a massive one to tackle right out of the gate.
It is, but we cannot understand human motives if we cling to the belief that we are the uncaused authors of our own actions. To dismantle this, the book painstakingly details the evolution of moral feelings, breaking it down into 4 distinct phases of historical error.
We really need to look closely at how the concepts of good and bad mutated over millennia.
Yes. So in the very first phase, human beings judged single actions strictly by their consequences. An act was designated good or bad solely based on whether its outcome was utilitarian or prejudicial to the community.
Like, if someone stole the tribe's winter food supply, the action wasn't judged as inherently evil. It was bad entirely because the tribe might starve. The judgment was purely pragmatic.
Precisely. So the label belonged to the result, not the action itself. But over vast stretches of time, we enter the second phase.
Where the origin is forgotten.
Right. The origin of this utilitarian designation is forgotten entirely. Humanity begins to imagine that the action in itself, without any reference to its consequences, contains the intrinsic property of good or bad.
The book compares this to a fundamental linguistic and sensory error, right? It is like calling a stone hard or a tree green.
Yes,
Yeah.
we mistake what is actually a consequence of our sensory perception for a fundamental cause embedded in the object. We project our reaction onto the thing itself.
And then comes the third phase. The label of good or bad detaches from the physical action and moves inward, attaching itself to the motive behind the action.
The intent becomes the crime or the virtue.
Exactly. And finally, in the fourth phase, the label moves even deeper, attaching to the very nature of the man. We no longer say the consequence is bad, or the action is bad, or the motive is bad.
We say the man himself is bad, and his motives merely grow out of his corrupted nature like toxic plants from poisoned soil.
Which is a staggering realization if we follow that logic to its endpoint. If the nature of the man is entirely synthesized out of the elements and influences of past and present things, then it is merely a necessary consequence of biology, environment, and history.
Therefore, man is to be made responsible for absolutely nothing. Not for his nature, not for his motives, and not for his conduct.
But wait, we have to look carefully at how this directly contradicts some major foundational ideas, specifically Schopenhauer's right.
Yes. Schopenhauer observed that human beings feel deep depression and remorse, a consciousness of guilt after committing a certain act. And Schopenhauer's logic was that this remorse mathematically proves we must have had the freedom to choose otherwise.
He created a distinction between our inner being and our outward actions, right?
Right. The essay, Our Inner Being, which he claimed belonged to the sphere of absolute freedom and the operari ment. Our outward actions, which belong to the sphere of strict observable causality.
Wait, let me break that down for a second. Schopenhauer thought that because I feel guilty about an action, I must have freely chosen the inner nature that caused me to execute that action. That seems like a massive leap in logic. How does the book dismantle that specific assumption?
By pointing out that the presence of an emotion does not validate the premise behind it. Remorse does not prove we are fundamentally free. It proves only that we erroneously assume we were free.
We feel guilty because society has spent thousands of years conditioning us to believe we are the authors of our actions.
Exactly. The guilt is real, but the foundation of the guilt is a manufactured illusion.
I mean, if you are listening to this right now, your immediate instinct is probably to push back heavily. You are likely thinking, well, if no one is responsible for their acts or their nature, if everything is just a chain of inevitable unchosen causality, aren't we just animals?
And the book actually anticipates this exact panic. It states plainly that the beast in us must be wheedled.
It argues that without the errors involved in the assumptions of ethics, man would have simply remained an animal.
Right, we invented these rigid, fabricated laws and imposed them upon ourselves strictly so we wouldn't tear each other to pieces. Ethics are an illusion, yes, but they are a vital survival mechanism.
So if we accept that free will is an illusion, and that we only invented ethics to survive, then the concepts of good and evil cannot be universal truths handed down from a higher power. So where did we actually get them?
The book dictates that they are purely rooted in power dynamics. It outlines a two-fold historical origin of good and evil, beginning with the spirit of the ruling races and castes.
The master class.
Right to the powerful. The master class, the term good simply meant having the power to requite. It meant you had the capacity to repay good with good and evil with evil. You were a recognized equal in the economy of power.
Whereas bad, on the other hand, did not mean wicked or sinful. It meant being powerless, subjugated, and fundamentally unable to requite.
The powerless were a quantity mere dust to be swept aside.
Which completely flips when you examine the perspective of the subjugated class. To the powerless, every other man is a potential threat, hostile, inconsiderate, and greedy.
To them, bad is the defining characteristic of the powerful, the masters.
And what requires real psychological observation here is how the subjugated view kindness. To a completely powerless person, any manifestation of goodness, sympathy, or helpfulness from a superior is viewed with extreme paralyzing anxiety.
It is not seen as grace. It is seen as a trick, a deception, a refined form of badness designed to lower their guard before the inevitable strike.
Which brings us to a really fascinating nuance about gratitude. This relentless dissection of power mechanics extends even into emotions we consider universally wholesome.
Right. The book argues that gratitude is actually a mild, socially acceptable form of revenge.
Which sounds crazy until you break down the mechanics of a favor.
Exactly. Consider the mechanical interaction. When a benefactor does something for a powerful man, that benefactor has essentially invaded the domain of the powerful man. They have disrupted the hierarchy and established a momentary supremacy.
Or at least an equal footing. So in order to restore the balance of power, the recipient must in turn invade the domain of the benefactor through the act of gratitude.
So gratitude isn't a warm, selfless exchange. It is a defensive maneuver.
Right. If you don't show gratitude, you are accepting a permanent deficit in power. You are showing yourself as powerless to requite. It is a transaction where the currency is social dominance.
Which means the justice isn't a moral absolute at all. It is just a temporary ceasefire between two equally armed camps.
That is the exact conclusion. Justice only actually exists among approximate equals in power.
Right, when there is no demonstrable supremacy between two parties, and a physical struggle would only lead to mutual useless destruction, the pragmatic reflection arises that a compromise would be best.
Each surrenders to the other what the other wants. Justice, at its absolute core, is reprisal and exchange. It reverts naturally to the standpoint of raw self-preservation.
The underlying thought is always, why should I injure myself to no purpose?
Only because children have been taught for thousands of years to admire these acts of compromise have we forgotten their origin in pure egoistic utility. We now mistakenly view justice as a noble, unegotistical virtue.
Think of a hostage negotiation or a besieged city from antiquity. When a besieged city yields to a stronger party under stipulated conditions, the counter-stipulation is that completely destroying the city would inflict great damage upon the conqueror's own prize.
The conqueror wants the resources intact. The law of the weaker only exists to the extent that the weaker party can still be useful, or to the extent that destroying them is too inconvenient or costly.
The famous dictum holds, each has as much law on his side as his power extends.
And knowing this, we are forced to confront how absurdly we romanticize these concepts. I mean, we prize love over justice, treating it as some higher divine entity. But the book suggests love is actually palpable stupidity.
It is blind. It distributes its gifts to everyone completely unmerited.
It is impartial and indifferent, exactly like the rain, which wets both the just and the unjust right to the skin without any capacity for discernment.
And if justice and goodness are fundamentally rooted in calculated power and self-interest, the book then applies the scalpel to interrogate the emotions we consider the most pure.
Sympathy, compassion, and self-sacrifice.
Right. What is the secret selfish root of pity?
Yeah.
The book brings back La Rochefoucauld, who warned all those endowed with the reason to be heavily on their guard against compassion.
Why? Because the thirst for sympathy is actually a thirst for self-enjoyment at the direct expense of one's fellow creatures. Let us observe children who cry and scream simply to be compassionated.
They do not wail into the void. They wait for the exact moment their condition will be observed by someone else.
Or consider the sick and oppressed in spirit. They're wailing, they're dramatic posturing, they're posing in misfortune. It has a highly calculated aim, and that aim is to cause pain to the beholder.
When the beholder manifests sympathy, it consoles the unfortunate person because it proves to them that despite all their physical or social weakness, they still possess the psychological power to inflict pain on the world.
The unfortunate person experiences a rush, a species of joy in the sense of superiority that the manifestation of sympathy entails. It is the ultimate ruthlessness of the dear self.
The book pushes this concept of the dear self into even more uncomfortable territory by analyzing the ultimate acts of supposed unegoism. Is the soldier dying on the battlefield for his country truly unegoistic?
Or is the mother sacrificing her sleep, her nourishment, and her health for her infant truly acting without ego? The book insists the answer is no.
Hold on. You are telling me a mother literally starving herself so her child can eat is acting out of ego. That feels impossible to accept. How does the book justify stripping the nobility from an active survival instinct like that?
By fundamentally redefining how we view the self. In all these cases, man is not acting as an individuum, a singular, indivisible entity. He acts as a dividuum, a divisible entity composed of competing drives.
So the mother or the soldier simply loves one part of themselves, a thought, a longing, a deeply held ideal, more than they love another part of themselves, such as their physical health or their biological life.
Exactly. They analyze their own being and willingly sacrifice one internal part to nourish another internal part. The drive to fulfill the ideal simply overpowers the drive for biological preservation. It is still the self satisfying the self.
I like to unpack vanity, using an analogy of a psychological storefront. The book describes the human mind without vanity as incredibly poor, but with it, the vain man stocks a well-replenished, ever-renewing emporium.
Where the only accepted currency is admiration.
Right, but the profound irony is that the vain man creates this fake, unduly exalted image of himself and sells it to you purely so he can buy into your reaction.
He wants to borrow that external authority to fortify his own opinion of himself.
He misleads you into thinking he is great, just so he can rely on your delusion to fund his own self-esteem. It is an exhausting, infinite loop of self-deception.
And this loop applies to our grandest interpersonal promises as well. If every underlying mechanism is ultimately selfish, can we ever genuinely promise to love someone forever?
The book clarifies that we cannot legally or morally promise feelings because feelings are entirely involuntary. What we are actually promising are actions.
We promise the deportment of love.
Right. We are essentially saying, as long as I love you, I will manifest the actions of love. But if I cease to love you, my deportment, although driven by a new hidden motive like duty, guilt, or habit, will remain exactly the same.
We swear to keep the mask securely fastened to our faces.
If we accept that premise, it forces us to look at the flip side of the coin. If our most virtuous, celebrated emotions are secretly selfish and calculated, are our explicitly bad acts fundamentally misunderstood?
The book argues they are entirely misunderstood. It unpacks this by comparing the execution of a criminal to a man swatting a fly.
All so-called bad acts are merely the impulse for self-preservation, or more accurately, the biological desire for pleasure and the avoidance of pain.
When we intentionally kill a fly, we do it without a shred of moral guilt, simply because its buzzing is physically disagreeable to our nervous system.
We punish a criminal and inflict pain upon him for the exact same mechanical reason: to protect ourselves, remove an irritant, and preserve society's comfort.
In both cases, the act is justified entirely by necessity and self-preservation. Whatever man does, he always does what seems to him good or advantageous according to the degree of his intellect at that exact moment.
The book introduces this incredible, almost biological concept regarding the limitation of our nerves. It asks a vital question: does a person ever fully know the pain they cause someone else?
The anatomical answer is no. We only shield ourselves from pain as far as our own nervous system extends physically.
Right, if our nerves literally biologically extended into the bodies of our fellow humans, if cutting your arm caused my arm to bleed and register agony, we would never cause each other pain.
We wouldn't be anatomically able to. Therefore, what we call wickedness is largely just a biological ignorance of another's pain, combined with the blind pursuit of our own pleasure.
We guess at their pain through mental analogy, But a mental analogy is never the same as a firing nerve ending.
And this culminating logic of biology, historical conditioning, and power dynamics leads to the book's ultimate defining metaphor, the waterfall.
Imagine standing at the base of a massive, roaring waterfall. You look up and see countless curves, spirations, and dashes of the waves. It looks like absolute chaos.
It looks like the ultimate manifestation of freedom impulse and spontaneous creation.
But in reality, everything is strictly compulsory. Every single drop of water is following a trajectory that is mathematically calculable based on physics gravity, the velocity of the current, and the exact placement of the rocks beneath.
The book states that human acts, human thoughts, and human moralities are exactly the same. We are held fast in the deeply comforting yet mathematically impossible illusion of volition.
Apply this waterfall directly to your own life. If the entire movement of the universe suddenly stopped short and an all-knowing reasoning intelligence with unlimited computational power were there to analyze the pause, it could calculate and foretell your every future delusion, your every good deed and your every bad deed to the remotest ages.
You are just a drop in the waterfall. Therefore, the very concept of a justice that rewards and punishes is utterly logically absurd. You don't praise a water drop for successfully reaching the bottom of the falls, nor do you punish a drop for violently splashing against a rock.
The book reveals that praise and blame are not moral verdicts handed down from the heavens. They are merely utilitarian tools. They are heavy stones we throw into the water to artificially alter the flow of the next millions of drops.
Understanding this machinery is what the book calls the bitterest drop in the cup of knowledge. To truly internalize the absolute irresponsibility of man, to realize his complete and unalterable non-guilt, strips away the traditional poetic nobility of human nature.
If you are accustomed to seeing moral responsibility and duty as the patent of humanity's nobility, this knowledge destroys that patent. It makes all your moral indignation, all your deeply held preferences, and all your righteous, fiery dislikes entirely worthless and false.
Now that you see the waterfall for what it truly is, now that you understand that every act of cruelty, every tear of sympathy, and every moral judgment is just the inevitable, mathematically calculable crashing of water over the rocks, how will you look at the people who wrong you tomorrow? Will you cling to the comforting delusion of their guilt, or will you stand in the icy air of this absolute truth? You take a scoop of baking soda, which is, just a mild base, and you mix it with some standard household vinegar.
Right, just a weak acid.
Exactly. And the moment they touch, it is absolute immediate chaos. They violently erupt, bubbling and foaming all over the edge of the glass.
It's a complete mess, yeah.
Yeah, but if you are standing in your kitchen watching this happen, you don't cross your arms and say, wow, that vinegar is truly evil for destroying the baking soda.
No, of course not.
And you certainly don't praise the baking soda for making some, spectacular, virtuous sacrifice. You don't assign merit or blame to the liquids.
Because you recognize the event for exactly what it is. It's the completely inevitable result of chemical elements interacting under a very highly specific set of physical conditions.
Right. They had absolutely no choice in the matter. They were just compelled by their atomic nature.
And that chemical inevitability is exactly how the book views human morality. It presents a radically uncomfortable proposition, really. It argues that human behavior operates on the exact same deterministic principles as your vinegar and baking soda.
Which is a huge pill to swallow.
It is. The book argues, with this chillingly calm logic, that judging human conduct as good or evil is fundamentally as irrational as blaming nature for a thunderstorm.
Like getting mad at the sky for raining.
Exactly.
Oh.
When we stand in the presence of a beautiful plant or a breathtaking piece of art, we might admire its strength or its capacity or its form,
Yeah.
but we don't praise the plant for its merit,
Because it didn't choose to be beautiful.
Right. It didn't sit there and decide to grow that way. It's merely a product of biological necessity. And the author insists we must look at human conduct, including our own internal thoughts, through that exact same cold lens.
So if you truly internalize that framework, if you really let that sink in, it means every single choice you make is just a reaction. Every moment of unexpected kindness, every flash of cruelty, it's just a biological and psychological chemical reaction.
Yes, entire.
You are simply driven by whatever the strongest motive happens to be at that exact millisecond. So does the book suggest that this completely erases the entire concept of human guilt?
It erases it completely. And that erasure is the fundamental premise we have to confront before we can understand anything else in the text.
It's the foundation of the whole argument.
Right. Because we like to imagine we sit in this little mental command center, freely choosing between option A and option B.
Like pulling levers.
Exactly, pulling levers. But the book argues that, in reality, We're just torn this way and that by contending motives. Fear, hunger, vanity, empathy. They all fight it out until we finally decide in favor of the strongest one.
Or I guess the strongest motive decides for us.
Oh, that is a much more accurate way to phrase it, yes. The strongest motive decides for us. And the transition required to accept this, to move from being a creature obsessed with morality and blame to a creature guided by what the book calls wisdom, is immensely painful.
It's not a gentle awakening.
Not at all. The book uses this visceral metaphor of a butterfly. It insists upon breaking through the cocoon, tearing it to pieces violently. And then you emerge blinded and confused by the strange, harsh light of a new realm of liberty.
Because realizing that everything is necessity means you realize that all is guiltlessness.
Right.
But the book pushes this even further, doesn't it? It obliterates the boundary between what we consider righteous and what we consider wicked.
It does. It claims there isn't actually a different root cause for a saint's action versus a criminal's action.
Which is wild to think about.
A text states that between good and bad actions, there is no difference in kind. There is only a difference in degree. Good acts are described as simply sublimated evil, and bad acts are degraded or imbruted good.
Okay, let's break those terms down for a second, because that is a really heavy philosophical concept. Sublimated evil and imbruted good.
Think of it this way. Sublimation means channeling a base, aggressive impulse into something socially productive.
Okay.
So, a surgeon cutting into a person to save their life might be sublimating a primal fascination with power or physical dominance.
Wow, so it's the same root impulse as, like, a violent assailant?
Exactly the same root impulse. It's just channeled or sublimated into a necessary, socially accepted good action.
And the flip side of that is the imbruted good.
Right. An imbruted good is a noble impulse that has been degraded into something brutal. A father's desire to protect his family is a good impulse, obviously.
Sure.
But if it degrades into extreme paranoia, where he violently attacks a harmless neighbor out of misplaced fear, that is an imbruted good. They spring from the exact same root.
The individual's desperate longing for self-gratification and self-preservation.
Yes. Whether that gratification is obtained through vanity, revenge, cunning, or through so-called self-sacrifice and sympathy, it is all just the ego seeking its necessary satisfaction.
But, I mean, if human action is pure necessity and guilt is just this grand manufactured illusion we've wrapped ourselves in, the immediate question that arises is why?
Right. Why build the system?
Yeah, why did humanity spend millennia building these immense, crushing systems of moral judgment, of magic, of complex religious worship?
It's a very fair question.
It almost reminds me of, well, think of a desperate gambler at a roulette table.
Okay.
When a gambler wears a specific lucky shirt or taps the felt table 3 times before rolling the dice, they are terrified of the chaos of the game.
Right. They want control.
Exactly. They are trying, through a physical ritual, to impose a reliable rule onto pure mathematical randomness.
Is that basically what early humans were doing with morality and religion?
That analogy captures the primitive mind perfectly, actually. Because to understand the progression from chaos to organized religion, we really have to recognize that early humans had absolutely zero concept of natural laws.
They didn't know about physics or biology.
Exactly. For them, there was no invisible physics governing the world. Sickness, a sudden drought, even a stone unexpectedly rolling down a hill, these were not the results of gravity or meteorology.
They thought they were intentional.
Primitive humans believed these were the actions of conscious, willing spirits. And because early humans lived lives strictly governed by rigid tribal traditions, when they looked out at the unpredictable forces of nature, they saw a terrifying domain of ultimate freedom and arbitrary volition.
It must have been terrifying. Utterly terrifying. So to survive, they had to find a way to dictate laws to this stronger, frightening entity. They had to figure out how to bind the chaos.
They essentially had to bribe the universe. I mean, if the rainstorm is a conscious spirit, you can negotiate with it.
And that negotiation is the literal birth of magic. It began as a desperate system of bribes, offerings, flatteries, prayers, all designed to win the partiality of these nature spirits.
And that evolved over time.
Right, over time, it evolves into incantations.
Yeah.
There is this belief that by controlling a corporeal element, like an effigy or a painted image, you could physically bind the spirit attached to it.
So the magician's job was literally to force nature to comply.
Yes. But as human societies grew, these chaotic, desperate magical rituals became way too complex. Pains were taken to systematize them. The tribes began aligning these magical ceremonies with the great reliable cycle of the seasons.
Like the solstices, the equinoxes, the harvests.
Exactly. And this is a crucial pivot in the book. Religion, at its very core, is simply formalized magic. The magician is older than the priest.
Oh.
Yeah, the priest merely took the magician's chaotic bribes and turned them into a bureaucratic calendar of worship.
And the book draws a really fascinating contrast here with the ancient Greek perspective, right? The Greeks didn't seem to view their gods with the same terror that later religions did.
The Greek framework was entirely different. For the ancient Greeks, the gods were not incomprehensible, tyrannical masters. They were viewed more like a higher caste of ideal humans.
They had flaws, they bickered, they had desires.
Right, and because of that, a Greek citizen felt they could form a mutual alliance with their gods. They saw their own reflection in Olympus.
But the later religious systems that eventually dominated humanity, particularly those originating in the Middle East and evolving into modern Western frameworks, they relied on something far darker.
Much darker. Crushing fear and profound subjection. The relationship shifted from an alliance to total subservience.
Which brings us directly to how the book views the modern religious framework, specifically Christianity. It frames it as this protruding, ghostly relic surviving from a barbaric antiquity.
It does. It argues that it forces modern, supposedly rational minds to swallow concepts that are fundamentally archaic.
I mean, if you really look at the literal doctrines, a god demanding a vicarious sacrifice, a crucified savior, the symbolic drinking of blood, and this obsessive, looming fear of the afterlife.
The text calls it explicitly un-Greek.
Un-Greek.
Yeah, it is un-Greek because it wasn't designed to elevate humanity or form a partnership. According to the text, this system was designed to debase, oppress, and stupefy people into the deepest mire of self-loathing.
That is a brutal assessment.
It is, but the psychological mechanism is brilliant in its cruelty. You crush the individual's self-worth so entirely that when a sudden artificial flash of divine compassion is introduced, it feels overwhelmingly powerful.
Like giving water to someone you've intentionally dehydrated.
Exactly. The book argues the ultimate cleverness of this system is that it makes everyone feel universally sinful. If we are all fundamentally broken and guilty, it neatly neutralizes interpersonal contempt, creating a docile, easily managed flock.
Okay, I have to push back here, or at least play devil's advocate for you listening, because the book makes a massive leap. It claims that true selflessness is an illusion.
It does.
But isn't unegoistic conduct real? What about a mother who deliberately starves so her child can eat?
That's the classic counterargument.
Right. She is literally overriding her biological imperative to survive. How can the book look at that staggering level of sacrifice and claim she is just being selfish?
It is a profound challenge. And it's the exact scenario where the book applies its most rigorous, cold psychological precision. The argument is that an ego simply cannot act without an ego.
Okay, but how does that apply to the mother?
Well, the text references thinkers like Lichtenberg and La Rochefoucauld to make a startling point about human affection. They argue we do not actually love others, we only love the feelings that others inspire within us.
Wait, really? So the mother isn't acting for the child at all, she's acting for herself?
The mother acts because the internal psychological pain of watching her child starve is far more intolerable to her than the physical pain of her own hunger.
Oh.
Right. If she eats the food while her child suffers, her psychic agony, her guilt, her emotional devastation would destroy her.
So her sacrifice is driven by an internal compulsion to alleviate her own psychic suffering.
Exactly. She is unconsciously choosing the lesser of two pains to maintain her own internal equilibrium. Therefore, the action is still fundamentally rooted in the ego. It is a biological calculation.
That is a brutal way to look at love.
Brutal, but logically consistent within this framework. The book argues that even an all-loving God, as traditionally conceived by theology, could not act without an internal personal compulsion.
Even God has motives.
Right. A God who creates a universe or saves a soul is still fulfilling its own divine desires. And this is where the trap of religion lies. It sets up an impossible standard, a purely unegoistic, totally selfless God, and measures human behavior against it.
But this is measuring biological reality against a fable.
Precisely. Because human beings literally cannot act without a personal motive. Measuring us against a mythical standard of total selflessness deliberately engineers a false, inescapable feeling of sin.
We are condemned for simply operating according to our biological hardware.
Exact.
So we are essentially diagnosed with a disease that doesn't actually exist simply because we don't match an impossible anatomical model.
That's a great way to put it.
And this leads us to the mechanics of the spiritual awakening or the overwhelming need for salvation. Let's think about it like, well, imagine suffering from a severe physical fever in the Middle Ages.
Okay.
Long before anyone knew what germs or white blood cells were. You are burning up, you're hallucinating, you are convinced you are going to die.
You're in total despair.
Right. But then, simply because your biological immune system finally does its job and clears the infection, the fever breaks. You wake up feeling this sudden, miraculous wash of cool relief.
It feels like a miracle.
Yes. But because you don't know what an immune system is, you look at that sudden relief and falsely attribute it to an invisible ghost or a saint who must have magically cured you in the night.
You invent a savior.
Exactly. So is the book saying that this profound feeling of religious grace is entirely self-grace? Like we are essentially saving ourselves from our own manufactured guilt and then giving all the credit to a phantom.
That is the precise psychological mechanism the text outlines, stripped completely of any mythology. A person feels a deep, crushing depression. Why? Because they are constantly comparing their natural, ego-driven actions to that impossible, fable-like standard of an unegoistic God.
They can never measure up.
Never. They see divine anger in every misstep. They feel intensely inadequate and sinful. However, human emotions and the nervous system are inherently transient.
You can't stay sad forever.
Exactly. The body cannot sustain a state of absolute exhausting despair indefinitely. Eventually, the biochemical exhaustion wanes, the depression naturally lifts, and the person feels their innate vitality and self-love begin to return.
The psychological fever breaks.
Yes, the fever breaks. They're bewildered by this sudden influx of joy and lightness, but instead of recognizing it as a natural biological and psychological reset, just the simple restoration of their own baseline health, they falsely interpret this recovery as divine grace descending upon them from an external power.
Because they lack the psychological vocabulary to understand their own biology.
Precisely. The foundational requirement for being religious, therefore, is possessing what the author calls a false psychology.
False psychology.
Yes. It is a wandering of reason and imagination that refuses to interpret natural emotional cycles rationally. Once you scientifically understand your own emotional mechanics, once you see the psychological immune system at work, to use your analogy, the entire architecture of faith collapses.
Because you realize you were the one who made yourself sick with an impossible standard.
And you were the one who eventually healed yourself.
Wow. But if everyday faith is a misinterpretation of our own emotional cycles, we really have to confront the most extreme example.
The ascetics.
The ascetics and the saints, yeah. The people who seem to defy biology entirely. We look at them fasting in the desert, whipping themselves, giving up all worldly pleasure. And the natural human instinct is to think, well, that must be supernatural.
Right. No normal person could endure that without divine help.
Exactly. But the book brutally strips away this aura. It argues that asceticism, this extreme self-denial, is not holy at all. It is a manifestation of extreme vanity.
To understand the ascetic, we have to look at the concept of the inner enemy.
The inner enemy.
Yes. Certain strong-willed individuals possess tyrannical impulses, a deep, restless need to dominate and conquer. When they lack external enemies or worldly success, when they have no empires to build or wars to fight, they don't simply turn off that drive.
You just redirect it.
Exactly. They turn it inward. They crush their own nature to feel a sense of absolute power over themselves.
It makes me think of like a high-energy, hyper-intelligent working dog, like a border collie.
Oh, that's a good analogy.
Yeah, if you take a dog bred to run 10 miles a day and herd hundreds of sheep, and you lock it in a small, empty apartment with absolutely nothing to do, no tasks to perform, it will completely lose its mind.
He gets distractive.
It will eventually start chewing its own paws raw just to have a battle to fight, you know, a physical problem to solve. So the saint isn't transcending humanity. They're just a deeply bored, powerful individual manufacturing a violent internal war just to feel alive.
The book supports that exact dynamic. The saint creates an artificial battlefield. And what is truly fascinating is how this extreme behavior actually makes life easier for them.
Wait, easier? How is starving in a cave easier than living a normal life?
Because by completely surrendering their personal will to an all-encompassing strict ritual, They escape the heavy, exhausting burden of making individual choices. But unconditional obedience to a rule, even a really painful one, is psychologically far simpler than navigating the nuanced, conditional, and ambiguous choices of everyday life.
You don't have to decide who to love or what career to pursue or how to navigate complex social ethics.
You just obey the fasting schedule. It's simple. Furthermore, their extreme physical practices, particularly their sexual and caloric abstinence, cause their physical bodies to break down.
Which messes with their brain.
Exactly. It makes their imaginations become obscenely riotous. They experience visions, hallucinations, terrors. But instead of recognizing these as the natural neurological blowback of extreme physical deprivation, they externalize them as demons they must fight.
Because they need the war.
Yes. They bounce violently between megalomaniacal self-deification, believing they are the chosen pure vessels of the divine, and abject self-contempt. The fasting, the scourgings, the madness, these are not holy transcendence.
They're spectacles.
They are desperate, highly stimulating spectacles used to sate a soul that has grown utterly weary of natural human existence.
So, if religion, the concept of manufactured sin, and the extreme spectacles of asceticism are all psychological sicknesses, if they are forms of what the book calls a romanticism that softens, corrupts, and enervates the intellect, what is the cure?
There is a cure, but it isn't easy.
How does a person who realizes all of this actually move forward?
Yeah.
The book prescribes a really harsh convalescence. I view it like a grueling physical detox.
It's a great comparison.
You can't taper off slowly from this kind of deep-seated delusion. You have to walk out into the freezing cold, strip away every comforting illusion, every warm blanket of self-pity and metaphysical hope, and just sit alone in the harsh, biting light until your mind clears.
The text calls it a severe anti-romantic self-treatment. And romanticism here doesn't mean love.
Right.
It means the soft, emotion-driven illusions that comfort us. The text notes that this romanticism is incredibly seductive. It claimed even the greatest artists of the author's time, like the composer Richard Wagner, who completely surrendered to its emotionally manipulative pull.
So you have to fight that pull.
To survive it, one must enforce a regime of coldness. The book advocates for a minimum of life. You must unfetter yourself from heavy sensuality, avoid art and music that emotionally manipulate your yearning, and embrace the tub of Diogenes.
Okay, just to make sure we're on the same page, Diogenes is the ancient Greek philosopher who literally lived in a ceramic tub on the streets of Athens, right?
Yes, that's him.
The guy who famously threw away his only wooden bowl when he saw a child drinking from his hands because he realized he didn't even need the bowl. He was the ultimate rejecter of societal comfort.
That's the one. And by invoking the tub of Diogenes, the book isn't telling us to literally move into a clay jar.
Right, obviously.
It's a metaphor for absolute intellectual independence. It's a stance of total detachment from outward favor or disfavor. It is a solitary, painful process of seeking a new, unclouded health.
A detox.
Yes, a detox. You transform from being a sufferer, trapped by guilt and the need for salvation, into what the book calls a free spirit.
A free...
Yes. This free spirit looks down upon the world not with the love of a saint and not with the hate of a cynic, but with pure, unadulterated understanding. This painful shedding of the skin of romanticism is the only way to earn back one's true life task. The ultimate goal, as the author states, is to become nothing less than the conscience of the modern soul.
Imagine for a moment an entire society that has successfully shed the hereditary habit of moral judgment. If you woke up tomorrow and viewed every single action of the people around you, their kindnesses, their betrayals, their successes, their failures, with the cold, clear, entirely guiltless eye of an astronomer watching planets orbit their sun, would you lose your humanity? Or would you finally, for the very first time, discover what it actually means to be free? Imagine a brand new concept walking right into your living room, almost like an uninvited stranger. You don't just objectively observe this idea as it stands there. You instantly, instinctively, you personify it.
Yeah.
If the idea is aggressive, if it enters your mind feeling defiant or autocratic, demanding absolute obedience, you immediately try to fight it. You reach for a linguistic weapon. You place a perhaps or a probably next to the concept just to disarm it, to shatter the oppressive tyranny of its unconditionality. But if that new idea enters in a gentle shape, if it appears weak, humble, heavily qualified, you adopt it like a shivering stray cat.
Yeah.
You stroke it, you feed it, you give it strength, and you silently test your own internal autocracy by seeing if you can act as a chivalrous, benevolent parent to this fragile little thought.
It's A truly remarkable observation on the most intimate, often unacknowledged experience of the thinker. You, sitting quietly and listening to this, you might comfortably believe that your pursuit of knowledge is driven by a pure, unadulterated impulse for objective truth.
Yeah, that's what we all like to think.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But the argument presented in the book suggests that the human brain simply cannot conceive of an object impersonally. We associate with our thoughts as if they were independent, living individuals. We fight them, we nourish them, and perhaps most fascinatingly, we play matchmaker with them.
Matchmaker, I love that.
Right. When we see two separate, isolated judgments, we are genuinely tickled by the prospect of drawing a conclusion. We unite them in wedlock, so to speak. And why do we do this? Because we anticipate that if a profound consequence follows this intellectual union, we, as the matchmakers, will gain the honor of the discovery. We act as the indefatigable kingmakers in the history of the intellect.
Wow.
We exalt ideas to the throne, and the very moment we grow suspicious of their power over us, we cast them down and crown their adversaries.
But the book poses a really vital question regarding this secret combat, this clandestine matchmaking and child-rearing of thoughts. Why, in the end, do we tend to prefer the true to the untrue? Because it makes a point to strip away all our romanticism here. It insists we do not seek the truth out of some pure, transcendent nobility of the soul.
Precisely. We prefer the true to the untrue. For the exact same utilitarian reason, we practice honesty in our daily, mundane interactions with other people.
But it's easier.
Because it is simply more expedient, more reputable, and less likely to collapse under pressure. In the realm of thought, an intellectual edifice built on error or falsehood feels structurally fragile, and our immense underlying human pride is constantly at stake.
Right.
The architect's self-esteem is profoundly humiliated if they discover they've built their life's philosophy out of poor, crumbling materials. Because man inherently considers himself the center of the universe, his vanity demands that he construct a monument to his own intellect that is nothing less durable than the world itself.
It's all about ego.
Entirely.
Yeah.
He desires to transform his fragile ego into something imperishable. Therefore, his immeasurable pride demands only the hardest, absolute best stones for his monument. And those hard, unyielding stones are what he designates as truths. Without this immense arrogance, which the book terms the vice of the sage, truth and its status on earth would be in a very perilous, fragile position.
Okay, let's unpack this. If our ego strictly demands these massive, immovable stones to build a monument to ourselves, it completely alters how we process the idea that absolute truth might actually be an illusion. If the foundation isn't solid, the entire monument of our identity threatens to collapse. And yet, the book makes a rather damning observation about our relationship with clarity and truth, pointing out a profound hypocrisy in how we seek knowledge.
Yes, it points to a deep underlying enmity to light. Consider a classroom setting, for example. If you patiently explain to a pupil that, strictly speaking, one can never truly speak of absolute, unshakable truth, but only of probability and its varying, shifting degrees, you will generally witness an undisguised, almost relieved joy in their reaction.
Wait, relieved joy?
Yes, relieved joy. Men actually prefer the uncertainty of their intellectual horizon. In their heart of hearts, they secretly hate truth because of its definiteness. A definite truth leaves no room for their own interpretations, their own ego, or their own escape routes.
So, what does this all mean? If we connect this to the bigger picture, is the book saying that we are fundamentally terrified of the light? I mean, are our souls really just crepuscular and bat-like, recoiling when the harsh light of definite truth is turned upon our own flaws?
The premise here argues that it is undeniably fear, rooted deeply in the preservation of the ego. We desperately wish to be of some consequence. And maintaining that illusion of consequence requires the active concealment of what we truly fundamentally are, which is small, flawed, and largely insignificant in the cosmic scale.
That is dark.
It is. The harsh, brilliant light of certainty strips away the shadows where our vanity hides. This intense aversion to the light perfectly explains what the book identifies as the hereditary sin of philosophers. Historically, philosophers are profoundly guilty of a specific intellectual fraud. They take the rough, highly localized maxims of moralists' rules and observations that perhaps only applied to a specific town for a single decade under very specific cultural conditions, and they attempt to mathematically prove them as absolute, universal necessities. They try to elevate themselves above mere local moralists by claiming cosmic universality for their ideas. The book targets Arthur Schopenhauer specifically for this exact intellectual sleight of hand.
Right, Schopenhauer's famous concept of the will. But how exactly does he commit this fraud? What is the actual linguistic trick he plays on the reader to make a localized concept feel like a universal truth?
It is a masterful, if completely deceptive, manipulation of language. Schopenhauer took the word will, which is a term meant strictly to denote a very specific, localized set of human conditions. Normally, will describes your conscious choice to, for example, lift a glass of water or walk across a room.
It implies a mind.
Exactly. It implies a mind, a desire, and an action. He took this strictly human psychological trait and filled a gap in the philosophical language to his own advantage. Driven by the philosophic craze for sweeping generalization, he turned this human condition into a poetic metaphor, claiming that all mindless things in nature, a rock falling to the earth, a plant stretching toward the sun, the orbit of a planet, possess this exact same will.
So he just projected human psychology onto physics.
Yes. And finally, to accommodate all kinds of disordered, comforting mysticism, the word was entirely misused by fraudulent convention. Fashionable philosophers blindly repeat this concept of the all-one will as if it were a profound, undeniable cosmic truth. The book scathingly remarks that describing the cold and different universes as singular, blind, all-one will is very much like trying to have the stupid devil for one's God.
The stupid devil for one's God. Wow.
It is a terrifying, irrational foundation built on a fundamental linguistic error. And we accept this error simply because our ego demands the illusion of an absolute, definite architecture in the dark.
So we build these grandiose philosophical structures in the dark using misused words precisely because we are terrified of looking at the actual walls enclosing us. And if we follow this logic, the darkest corner we hide and the one we defend most fiercely with the most elaborate linguistic tricks is the illusion of human morality and free will.
This is the critical, unforgiving boundary line. Insight into the stern, unyielding necessity of all human actions is the exact boundary that divides genuinely philosophic brains from all other brains. The ultimate reality presented here is the unconditioned non-freedom and non-responsibility of the human will.
No free will at all.
None. Morality itself is stripped of its divine or noble veneer and exposed simply as a ruthless utilitarian societal mechanism. The entire origin of morality lies in the cold calculation that the permanent interests of the community must unconditionally supersede the temporary interests of the individual.
So the individual is expendable.
Completely. Even if a specific individual is crushed, depressed, or entirely ruined by a social arrangement that happens to suit the mass, morality violently dictates that the victim must be brought to the sacrifice. The individual is reared and conditioned not as a solitary autonomous entity, but merely as a disposable cipher in a majority.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. If we realize there is no free will, the book says the philosopher must say, judge not. The philosophical brain wishes to be just, while everyone else desperately wishes to be a judge. And the illusion of free will is the anesthetic that makes that brutal sacrifice palatable. It keeps us docile in what is essentially described as a prison.
Yes, the metaphor the book uses is the gleaming brass wall of fate. It is a chilling image. Every intellectual backdoor that philosophers have frantically tried to leave open for themselves, hoping desperately that it leads out to the fresh, open air of free will and personal autonomy, only reveals, once again, the cold reflection of that gleaming brass wall. We are completely enclosed in a prison of cause and effect. We can only dream of freedom. We cannot actually make ourselves free.
But the psychological gymnastics people do to avoid this.
They are astonishing. Consider how the book examines Christianity when it is strained to its absolute logical limits. If every human action is completely determined by necessity, by the chain of cause and effect, then no single human is ultimately responsible for their actions. But the human mind, deeply conditioned and gripped by the agonizing consciousness of guilt, screams in despair, someone must be the sinner. Someone must be blamed.
Right, because without blame, the whole moral structure falls apart.
Exactly. Since they can no longer logically blame the individual wave in the stormy sea of cosmic development, they perform a staggering theological inversion. They decide the stormy sea itself is the sinner. They decide God is the sinner and man is somehow his redeemer. They twist the world's history into a convoluted narrative of guilt, expiation, and self-murder. It is described as a hideous grimace of the human heart, clinging violently to the ultimate contradiction. I am not responsible, but someone must be.
But wait, if we recognize this brass wall of fate, why does the book say this insight is the poorest in results? I mean, why does knowing the ultimate truth of determinism change absolutely nothing in human behavior?
That brings us to the concept of power without victory. The absolute strongest, most profound cognition a human being can achieve is the realization of the complete non-freedom of the human will. But it yields almost zero practical results in human society because it runs headfirst into the mightiest and most stubborn of all opponents, which is human vanity.
We want the credit.
Exactly. We fundamentally refuse to surrender the belief in our volitional character. We desperately demand the pleasure of justification by our own good works. We want to take personal, ego-driven credit for our virtues, our brilliance, and our kindness. And equally, we want the righteous, intoxicating right to condemn others for their vices. To genuinely accept the brass wall of fate is to accept that our towering brilliance and our deep compassion are mere necessities of nature, no different than a rock falling or a flower blooming.
It's like viewing our emotional lives as a covert espionage operation against reality. So, if our ego is that defensive, how does a mind that lies to itself about the very nature of the universe operate when it experiences something as intimate as falling in love?
It operates through profound, multi-layered self-deception. You constantly hear people, particularly poets, boast of self-oblivion in love or the beautiful absorption of the ego in the other person. The book shatters that romantic notion with utter ruthlessness. It argues that when you claim to be losing yourself in another, what you are actually doing is violently breaking the mirror of your own mundane reality. You throw yourself into another personality that you admire, and you begin enjoying a newly idealized, heavily curated portrait of your own ego. You are simply calling this new portrait by the other person's name.
Wait, really? Love is psychological identity theft.
That is precisely how the book frames it. It is not self-oblivion at all. It is an elaborate, deeply self-seeking theft from the treasury of knowledge. We purposefully banish our own flaws, our own mundane habits from our minds because we want the picture that beams back at us from this new relationship to flatter our vanity in a way our reality never could.
That is just brutally cynical. But I guess if you view humans as strictly deterministic, ego-driven machines, it tracks. And the same mechanism of covert ego preservation applies to our negative emotions too, right? Like envy and anger.
Very much so. The book dissects envy fascinatingly. Ordinary, everyday envy is incredibly easy to spot. It cackles loudly when the envied hen has laid an egg. In cackling, in gossiping, and complaining, it relieves its internal pressure and becomes milder. But there is a warning about a much deeper, far more dangerous envy, one that becomes dead silent.
Silent envy.
Yes. Deep envy desires that every mouth should be sealed about the success of the rival. It grows increasingly furious, precisely because this desire to silence the world is impossible to gratify. Silent envy grows in silence, suffocating the person from the inside.
And anger. How does anger fit into this?
Anger is typically viewed as a momentary loss of control. But here, anger is described as a highly effective, exhausting mechanism that forcefully brings the very dregs of the soul to light. It acts as an internal spy. If we cannot gain certainty about what our dependents, our employees, or our adversaries truly think of us through polite conversation, we unconsciously understand how to purposely arouse their anger. We provoke them.
So we use their anger to interrogate them.
Precisely. In their blinding rage, their carefully constructed diplomatic filters drop, and the hidden truth of what is really thought to our detriment is finally spoken. Anger is utilized as the ultimate tool of espionage against the human soul.
Honestly, living with that level of hyper-awareness where your love life is an egoistic illusion, your quiet colleague is harboring silent, suffocating envy, and your arguments are just covert interrogation tactics. It sounds utterly exhausting. If our internal lives are genuinely this fraught with vanity and manipulation, it makes perfect sense why we would desperately seek a mirage to escape. And the book identifies exactly where humanity runs for cover, the seductive mirages of religion and art.
The specific metaphor deployed here is the desert of science. The man of science, the seeker of actual truth, proceeds on a modest, incredibly toilsome wandering. True science requires immense physical and mental endurance, a tolerance for hardship, and most importantly, a complete suppression of the personality and the ego.
Right, which we've established human vanity hates.
Exactly. As you wander this dry, unforgiving desert of objective reality, you are suddenly confronted with brilliant, towering mirages possessing magic powers of deception. These are the great philosophical and religious systems. They project images showing you that the most refreshing draughts of the true water of life are close at hand. Your weary, exhausted heart rejoices at the sight.
But it's just sand.
It is a catastrophic illusion.
Yeah.
Those who are spellbound by these mirages are swallowed by the desert and forever lost to science. And those few who actually taste the mirage, who dive into the dogma and suddenly realize its deception, are left with a mouthful of sand, a salty taste, a raging thirst, and the bitter, humiliating realization that they haven't moved a single step closer to a real spring.
The critique is particularly brutal toward artists and poets in this regard. The book doesn't just call them entertainers, it labels them as active imposters who feign profound expertise in what they call the real reality.
Because the poet publicly acts as if he had been physically present at the spinning of the whole web of existence. He practices his beautiful frauds on pure ignoramuses, who then turn around and praise him for his deep mystical knowledge. Over time, the imposter actually becomes honest in his delusion and starts to genuinely believe his own sincerity.
Wow.
And the emotional public, thoroughly weary of the dry desert of actual reality, eagerly accepts the poetic dream. But here is the truly insidious mechanism. The poets do not just offer an alternative. They actively, intentionally disparage actual reality. They distort the physical world into something inherently sinful, sorrowful, and deceitful. They throw a rumpled veil of uncertainty over the world, replacing it with their own soul magic.
And religion operates on the exact same mechanism, right? The book talks about Christianity capitalizing on its lyric advantage.
Yes, the most effective artistic conception of Christianity lies in its monopolization of a single, devastatingly effective word: love. By utilizing this specific word as its core brand, it instantly appeals to the memory and the desperate hope of even the meanest intelligence and the coldest heart. The lyric advantage allows the theological error to make the promise of love come true entirely within the safe, unchallenged imagination of the believer.
To understand how this wizardry works in practice, the book spends a lot of time on Lawrence Stern. He is held up as the freest writer of all time, the absolute master of this kind of manipulation.
The analysis of Stern is incredibly revealing. He was recognized as the master of the endless melody. He continually, deliberately breaks definite form, thrusting the reader's mind into the realm of the indefinite. He operates epistemologically. He weaves profound philosophical truths and absurd farce together so tightly that as a reader, you never actually know if he is making a serious, tragic face or a smiling, mocking one.
It says his mind is like a squirrel soul, springing with insatiable, chaotic unrest from branch to branch. But I need you to clarify a highly specific phrase used there. The book mentions Stern possesses a carnal and spiritual hermaphroditism. That is a jarring phrase. Are we saying he blends base, physical comedy with ethereal spiritual philosophy so seamlessly that you literally can't separate the two?
Precisely. The carnal, the bodily, the absurd, and the spiritual, the transcendent, the philosophical, are perfectly indistinguishably fused in his writing. It completely disorients the reader's compass for what is true and what is a joke.
But is this wizardry always a bad thing? You are wandering the dry, modest desert of science. If art and religion provide a mirage that keeps you walking, aren't they serving a vital purpose for the human psyche, even if they are imposters?
It is a compelling defense. But the book's counterargument is deeply rooted in what these systems fail to demand of the human ego. Religion and art ask for absolutely no self-denial. They indulge and inflate the ego. They allow the individual to feel profound without ever demanding the rigorous, painful dismantling of one's own prejudices. Science, however, demands the ultimate, agonizing suppression of your personality. Art and religion offer cheap leisure. Science requires actual labor.
You're perpetually trading the dignity of truth for the anesthesia of comfort.
Yes, and that devastating critique of trading truth for comfort brings us to the ultimate, perhaps most cynical synthesis of the artist as an imposter, which is the concept of the pirate genius.
The pirate genius.
Yes. There are certain minds that arise in history who do not build their genius from the ground up through painstaking labor. Instead, they unscrupulously look out at all the unprotected good things of past ages, the forgotten techniques, the discarded wisdom of old masters. By sheer unadulterated impudence, this robber genius bids defiance to history. They shamelessly accumulate this stolen wealth, rebrand it with their own confident signature, and present it to the world, forcing the uneducated masses to stand in absolute awe of their robbery.
Think about that the next time you stand in awe of a so-called original masterpiece. Are you witnessing divine creation or just the brilliant impudence of a pirate genius who knew exactly which forgotten treasures to steal?
Imagine you are standing alone in an entirely quiet, white-walled gallery. On the wall to your left hangs a perfectly symmetrical, serene landscape painting.
Right.
It offers this quiet, harmonious beauty. Perhaps a still lake reflecting a meticulously ordered forest, but then you turn to your right.
And the contrast is jarring.
Exactly. Mounted on a heavy iron pedestal sits a bizarre, twisted stone gargoyle. Its features are completely exaggerated, monstrous, and deeply asymmetrical.
And we really prefer to tell ourselves that our highest, most cultivated sensibilities are drawn naturally to that serene landscape.
We do. We like to think of ourselves as refined. Yet, when you examine the psychological origins of our aesthetic tastes, you confront a rather uncomfortable truth presented in the book.
It's a fascinating pivot.
It really is. The human mind is magnetically, primitively drawn to the bizarre. The grotesque is actually an older, more luxuriant need for humanity than the beautiful.
Yes, the book frames the grotesque as a sort of coarser narcotic for the vast majority of mankind.
A coarser narcotic. I love that phrasing. It's a substance that mysteriously excites the imagination and pulls you entirely beyond everyday reality.
Well, to understand that magnetic draw, we have to really consider the very architecture of early human consciousness.
Right. Before we had all these comforts.
Precisely. Before humanity possessed the psychological luxury or the physical security to just sit back and contemplate pure, disinterested beauty.
Because existence back then was largely a brutal, monotonous struggle.
It was a life bound heavily by the immediate present. You were dictated by the terror of the elements and just the sheer exhaustion of survival.
So a subtle landscape painting wouldn't even register to a mind locked in that state of stress.
It wouldn't. The grotesque, with its terrifying and exaggerated features, it provided a necessary violent shock to the system.
That's why the book terms it a coarser narcotic.
Exactly. It doesn't require refined sensibilities or an educated palate or, a cultivated intellect to feel its effects.
It just bypasses all that higher cognition and jolts the nervous system directly.
Right. The primitive mind was often just trapped in the gray tedium of mere survival. It hungered for this intense stimulation simply to prove to itself that it was capable of feeling something beyond the daily grind.
Because the beautiful is subtle. It's a quiet, complex whisper.
But the grotesque is a scream.
A scream.
While for a species just awakening to the boundless potential of its own imagination, that coarse scream was a profoundly necessary escape from a really crushing reality.
Okay, so I understand the necessity of the scream, but I struggle to accept the trajectory of what happens next.
How we get from there to refinement.
Yes, exactly. If we begin with this primal craving for a coarse narcotic, how does the human sense of art actually evolve into something refined?
Well, the book outlines a highly specific, progressive ladder of artistic joy. It claims it's not just a sudden leap from the grotesque to the sublime.
It's a deliberate climb through distinct psychological stages. And the very first stage it identifies is the joy of the riddle.
Right, the pleasure of simply understanding what another person means.
But isn't art supposed to be fundamentally about raw emotion? How does treating a crude piece of art like a cognitive crossword puzzle lead to aesthetic joy?
I mean, it seems counterintuitive to our modern sensibilities, right? We prioritize emotional resonance above all else today.
We absolutely do.
But you must place yourself back in that hostile early environment. The cognitive joy of perception was paramount.
Just realizing that someone else is trying to communicate something to you.
Exactly. The first stage of artistic joy is the realization that a piece of communication, however rough it is, has successfully bridged the terrifying gap between two isolated minds.
So art, in its absolute infancy, functions as a conundrum.
It does. The pleasure you derive is actually the pleasure of your own quick perception. It's the immense satisfaction of solving the puzzle the artist presented.
It's the joy of realizing you aren't alone in the dark.
That's beautifully put. And once that cognitive bridge is built, the mind can move to the second stage.
Which shifts from intellectual satisfaction to emotional memory, right?
Yes, the roughest works of art begin to serve as anchors. They remind us of pleasant things we have actually experienced.
Like a victory in battle, or a successful chase, or a communal wedding.
Precisely. The art itself is not yet the object of beauty. It's merely a utilitarian vehicle to transport you back to a moment of personal triumph.
Which naturally brings us to the third stage, which the book describes as the glorification of danger and revenge.
A pivot toward a need for pure stimulation.
Right, it seems like a calculated victory over pure boredom. It's a way to artificially induce the thrill of excitement when the immediate environment is temporarily safe.
And that artificial induction of excitement prepares the mind for the fourth stage.
Which is fascinating.
It is. It's perhaps the most psychologically complex of the early steps, the act of overcoming the unpleasant.
Like listening to a tragedy or a disaster?
Yes. Consider the experience of listening to a daring seaman sing of his horrific mishaps, the crushing waves, his near-death experiences.
You feel a profound joy in listening to this harrowing tale.
You do. However, the book observes a critical psychological error we make here.
We give the credit to the art itself.
Exactly. The credit for this joy is mistakenly given to the art. In reality, the joy stems from witnessing the human triumph over adversity.
Mixed heavily with a quiet, kind of selfish relief that you are safe on the shore while the singer endured the storm.
Right. You are experiencing the pleasure of absolute safety contrasted with the vivid illusion of peril.
I can see how playing with the illusion of peril would eventually exhaust the psyche, though. I mean, you cannot sustain a state of artificial adrenaline forever.
No, it's exhausting.
So this must be the psychological bridge to the fifth stage, which is a radical shift toward the cult of symmetry.
After enduring the chaos of the storm, even vicariously, the mind suddenly craves math.
Math and order. You are identifying the mechanism perfectly. The mind tires of the unpredictable.
So in the fifth stage, you begin to experience a subtle, profound joy at the sight of all that is regular, orderly, and symmetrical.
In lines, points, rhythms.
Yes, and the underlying reason is one of survival analogy. This aesthetic symmetry awakens the feeling for all that is orderly in life itself.
Because order, reliable rules, strict proportion, those are the very things that keep us alive, safe, and prosperous in a dangerous world.
Therefore, when you feel aesthetic joy looking at a perfectly symmetrical architectural structure, you aren't merely admiring stone.
You are unconsciously singing a hymn of thanksgiving to the rules that guarantee your biological well-being.
That's the core of it.
There is a really fascinating parallel here to the acquisition of language, which I think helps clarify the sixth and final stage of this ladder.
Oh, how so?
Well, at first, you are desperate just to solve the riddle. You only want to understand the basic vocabulary the other person is using.
Like the first stage of art.
Exactly. Then, as you progress, you learn the grammatical rules. That represents the symmetry, the reliable order that makes communication safe, structured, and predictable.
Right, the fifth stage.
But the highest form of communication, the true poetry, only occurs when you have mastered those grammatical rules so thoroughly that you can begin to deliberately break them.
Ah, yes.
You violate the symmetry to create a profound, entirely new meaning that strict rules could never convey.
The linguistic parallel really holds up under scrutiny, especially regarding that final transition, because eventually the human mind becomes entirely satiated with symmetry.
It gets boring.
It becomes too safe. It borders on the very boredom we sought to escape back in the third stage.
So a higher aesthetic joy is born from the deliberate violation of the symmetrical.
You begin seeking reason in apparent unreason. This is the ultimate refinement.
It's an aesthetic riddle guessing that elevates the mind far beyond the initial need for simple patterns.
The artist invites you to find the hidden harmony in something that appears at first glance to be broken.
So if we accept that art functions as this complex, evolving riddle for the audience, it suggests a profound level of calculation on the part of the creators.
Absolutely. The artists of the era discussed in the book must have developed specific, highly manipulative techniques to construct these experiences.
The book unpacks what we might consider the artist's secret toolkit. It reveals utilities that defy our romanticized view of pure inspiration.
And the most striking example is the deliberate use of the mediocre.
Which sounds so backward. We operate under the assumption that a great artist avoids mediocrity at all costs, constantly striving for unrelenting brilliance.
But that assumption fundamentally misunderstands the cognitive limits of the audience. The book argues that great artists purposefully, surgically employ mediocre ideas.
To what end, though?
Well, if a creator strings together a series of purely brilliant, staggering thoughts, those thoughts will inevitably follow too closely upon one another.
They hide the view from each other.
Exactly. They crowd the mental landscape. The mediocre is utilized not out of a lack of talent, but as a strict architectural necessity.
It serves as a deliberate spacing mechanism.
Yes. It allows the truly brilliant thoughts the necessary temporal and emotional room to breathe, ensuring they are properly perceived and digested by you, the audience.
It really calls to mind the curation of a museum exhibit.
That's a great way to picture it.
Right. If you take 50 dazzling, complex masterworks and cram them onto a single unbroken wall, the eye simply glazes over.
The viewer becomes exhausted. They are unable to process the magnitude of what they're seeing.
You need the empty white space, the blank walls, the mediocre buffer, so that the brilliance of a single masterpiece has the silence required to actually command the room.
You are touching on the underlying psychology, but the artist's toolkit is even more subversive than simply providing blank space on a wall.
Really? How much deeper does it go?
It is about deliberately understimulating the audience for a calculated moment, starving their senses slightly, so that when the masterpiece finally appears, the impact is magnified tenfold.
Almost like psychological manipulation.
It is, and this manipulation extends deeply into the deliberate use of roughness and weakness.
Roughness.
Yes, artists across historical periods discovered that roughness projects a certain undeniable strength.
Because not everyone possesses the cultural or artistic power to be intentionally rough.
Exactly. To do so implies a confidence that transcends the desperate need for polish.
That makes a lot of sense.
Simultaneously, these creators understand that certain varieties of aesthetic weakness have a profoundly powerful, almost hypnotic effect on human emotions.
So an artist will utilize these emotional substitutes, actively manipulating your empathy and your perceptions?
They will. These are techniques that even the most conscientious, morally upright creators cannot abstain from using if they wish to move an audience.
That manipulative intent really casts a different light on another tool in this kit, which is brevity and the use of aphorisms.
Oh, the book has strong thoughts on this.
It does. It staunchly defends the use of short, incredibly dense philosophical statements.
But it notes that novice readers often view these brief statements with deep suspicion.
Right, treating them as raw, ill-prepared food that the author simply lacked the skill to cook into a full argument.
But the novice entirely misunderstands the nature of brevity in high-level thought.
Because a brief, dense dictum is not a fragmented, incomplete idea.
No, it is the final, concentrated harvest of long, arduous reflection.
The book actually offers a severe warning against those it categorizes as the worst readers. It compares them to a swarm of plundering soldiers.
That's such a vivid image. These readers do not wish to engage with the complex architecture of the philosopher's thought.
They simply want to break off a small, glittering piece of a concept, take what little they can use for their own preconceived arguments, and leave the rest in ruins.
Covering the original intent in the filth of their own misunderstanding.
They strip the general universal truth of an aphorism and reduce it to a vulgar curiosity.
And if artists are constantly manipulating space, form, weakness, and brevity to guide our psychology, it seems inevitable that this delicate machinery will eventually break down.
Yes, there must be periods in culture where the manipulation pushes the boundaries too far.
Where the art becomes overwhelmed by its own extravagance and destroys the careful balance of classical restraint.
The book draws a sharp, highly detailed distinction to illustrate this collapse. It specifically focuses on the difference between older classical forms of music and the new music of its era.
New music, which is characterized by endless melody and a total disregard for structural boundaries.
To clarify this collapse of structural integrity, the book utilizes a brilliant physical paradigm.
The fundamental difference between dancing and swimming.
Exactly. Older classical music required an immense amount of self-control from the listener.
It operated on a strict mathematical equilibrium, a precise balance of time and force within the soul.
Engaging with it was like executing a highly complex dance. It imposed a continual self-restraint.
The book describes it as providing a cooler draft of air mixed with warmth. It maintained a rigorous Apollonian structural integrity that kept the listener grounded.
The new music, however, is akin to walking into the sea and deliberately, gradually losing your firm tread on the bottom.
It no longer asks you to partner with it in a dance. It forces you to swim.
It demands that you surrender your ego unconditionally to the fluid, chaotic element.
We really must consider the physical reality of those two states. Think about the discipline required to execute a structured waltz.
You have to remain hyper-conscious of your own body, your partner, the dimensions of the room, and the mathematical timing of the music.
You are fully individuated. That is the classical dancing.
Contrast that with the experience of floating in a dark sensory deprivation tank, or being violently swept away in a chaotic wave pool.
It's completely different.
The new music does not want you to retain your individuality. It wants to dissolve your ego entirely.
It utilizes massive rhythmic paradoxes to simply overwhelm the soul.
But you mentioned earlier that the transition from symmetry to a higher art requires breaking the rules. How does this new music differ from that highest, sixth stage of aesthetic joy we talked about?
Is this unconditional surrender to the ocean actually a symptom of cultural decadence?
Right. Is it progress or decay?
It is the defining symptom of decadence. The text aligns this overwhelming, boundary-dissolving art directly with the concept of the Baroque style.
And it is crucial to understand that the Baroque always arises during the twilight of a great art form.
Yes, when the demands of classical expression become too restrictive for a culture that has lost its vitality.
Lacking the inner strength for true dialectic argument and the consecutive logical arrangement of ideas, the Baroque artist relies on forced rhetoric.
Absolute quantity and extreme dramatic tension.
The book uses the phrase ugly sublimity to describe this Baroque effect, which sounds like an irreconcilable oxymoron.
It does.
How can something be simultaneously ugly and sublime?
Well, it is sublime not because it is perfectly formed, but because of its sheer terrifying magnitude.
Ah, I see.
It forces awe through dissonance and overwhelming scale rather than through innocent perfection.
It aims to capture the heart by ambush, by surprise and brute force, rather than guiding it upward with honest proportion.
The Baroque is a luxury that hangs on the tree of culture like a heavy, overripe fruit. It signals that the classical era has exhausted its roots and is beginning to rot.
If modern art has become this decadent, overwhelming ocean that we use to drown our own consciousness, the book makes a staggering, counterintuitive claim about our relationship with culture.
It argues that we have completely inverted the true purpose of art and human life.
Modern society treats art as the main course, when historically it was only ever meant to be the dessert.
This represents one of the most profound and far-reaching critiques within the entire text.
The book asserts that art's primary highest purpose is not found in a museum or a concert hall.
No, its highest purpose is actually to embellish daily life itself.
Its true function is to make us endurable to others, to bind us to the quiet laws of decency, politeness, and cleanliness in our daily interactions.
Its supreme task is to conceal or transfigure the unavoidable, unconquerable ugliness of human nature so that society can function smoothly.
So the actual works of art, the framed paintings, the recorded symphonies, the published poems, they are merely accessories.
Just small practice grounds for this grander project of creating a beautiful, harmonious daily existence.
But we have entirely reversed that order. We hang on to the tail of the accessory, believing that the isolated works of art are the whole point of culture.
Precisely because it is easier to consume a masterpiece than to make your own life a masterpiece.
Ouch. That's painfully true.
As the book states, if you begin a dinner with dessert and try sweet after sweet, you will inevitably ruin your digestion.
You will destroy your appetite for the hearty, nourishing, difficult meal of actual life.
We gorge on the sweetness of artificial drama because we have lost the appetite for the slow, difficult work of daily virtue.
This requires a direct, perhaps uncomfortable reflection on how you live right now.
It really does.
Are you using binge watching, endless music streaming, and the obsessive daily consumption of media as a heavy perfume?
Are you using this ocean of content to cover up the fact that you haven't done the hard, unglamorous work of making your actual daily routine beautiful and orderly?
The book profiles exactly who craves this overwhelming narcotic art today, and the psychological profile is devastating.
It calls them the needers of art.
And who exactly are they?
They are the modern malcontents. They are the half-aristocratic.
They are the overworked scholars, the physicians, and the merchants who specialized too early in their careers and never gave their lives a free enough scope to develop a holistic personality.
They are highly efficient, functional members of society in their daily routines, but they operate with what the book calls a worm gnawing at their hearts.
So they aren't turning to art out of a celebration of life.
Far from it. They do not turn to art out of an overflow of joy or gratitude.
They turn to art as a palliative, to drive away hours of deep discomfort, crushing boredom, and half-bad conscience.
They desperately want art to transform the banal, embarrassing faults of their own characters into grand, sweeping tragedies of world destiny.
It is a decadent art born not from health, but from an underlying, unacknowledged disgust with oneself.
If our current relationship with art is essentially a coping mechanism for self-disgust, is there a historical model of a people who ate the main course first?
Yes, to see what a truly healthy relationship with art and life looks like, the book directs our attention back to the Greeks.
They operated on a fundamentally different psychological foundation.
They didn't use art as an escape pod from a miserable reality.
The Greek paradigm is essential to understanding what we have lost. The Greeks realized in their art the outflow and overflow of their own immense health and sense of well-being.
They were not running from themselves. They were led to art by a profound delight in themselves.
But the true genius of their psychological foundation goes much deeper than mere optimism.
They possessed what the book terms the pagan characteristic.
Instead of railing against the dark, evil, or barbaric parts of human nature, the passions that we might call all too human, they did something revolutionary.
They gave those dark passions a secondary right.
They didn't try to suppress or eradicate the animalistic streams within the psyche, which is what our modern morality constantly demands.
Instead, they institutionalized them. They created massive, state-sanctioned festivals, specifically designed to give these turbulent evil tendencies a moderate, scheduled, and harmless outflow.
Think of it like a precisely engineered pressure valve on a massive industrial steam engine.
That's a great analogy. You don't ignore the explosive pressure building up inside.
And you certainly don't pretend it isn't there.
Right. You manage its release so the engine doesn't blow apart and destroy the factory.
The pressure valve is the exact mechanical equivalent of their cultural engineering. They built their entire society, their state architecture, not upon a restricted, narrow priestly morality that demanded impossible purity from its citizens.
But upon the comprehensive, undeniable reality of all human qualities.
They understood a dark truth. The continued harmony of all things human requires the base notes.
It requires the integration of the dark, the inferior, the mean, and the wicked.
The Greeks wrestled simplicity, light, and classical restraint out of their native twilight precisely because they integrated their shadows.
They did not deny the reality of evil. They merely ensured it moderated itself, giving it a designated time and place so it did not inwardly poison the entirety of their daily lives.
This Greek model raises an incredibly important question for you to consider.
If the Greeks found such profound harmony and created such enduring beauty by giving their darkest instincts a scheduled moderate release, is our modern approach fundamentally flawed?
Is our relentless modern attempt to completely eradicate our flaws, to sanitize our minds and cancel our shadows, the very thing that is making us culturally and psychologically sick?
That question leads us directly to the fundamental difference between the antique world and the modern world regarding the experience of pleasure itself.
The ancient Greeks understood how to genuinely rejoice.
They continually invented new motives to feel happy, utilizing all their wealth of shrewdness and communal energy to celebrate festivals.
When faced with unavoidable suffering, they sought palliatives. They attempted, through art and communal myth, to convert the suffering into a pleasant or at least meaningful sensation.
But we moderns seem to operate on entirely different, much colder circuitry.
We do. We concentrate almost exclusively on solving problems to remove discomfort.
We attack the root causes of suffering to create a sterile state of absolute painlessness.
We do not know how to genuinely rejoice. We only know how to grieve less.
At this point, we must consider how this modern foundation of mere painlessness might eventually be used by a later age to once more set up a true temple of joy, and moving directly into.
Imagine sitting in a completely silent, dark room, trying to observe your core self. You strip away your job, your relationships, your daily stresses.
Right, the things that distract us.
Exactly. And what is left? You probably think you would eventually find your pure, isolated identity waiting there in the quiet.
Most people do.
But there is this deeply unsettling argument in the book that shatters this illusion of self-observation entirely. If you strip away the external world, you will find absolutely nothing.
Nothing at all. Because to truly know yourself, you require history. The past continues to flow through you in like 100 different unseen channels.
Which means you, sitting there listening to us right now, are nothing but your own sensation at this exact millisecond of a continuous historical flow.
It's heavily reliant on Heraclitus and that famous ancient aphorism, you cannot step twice into the same river.
Which is such a profound application of ancient wisdom to the modern ego.
It really is.
Yeah.
I mean, if you try to step down into the stream of your own personal development, the water has already moved on. You are never static. You are a process.
But the book argues that to truly understand this flowing history that makes up your mind, you don't actually need to travel the globe, right?
No, physical travel isn't a strict requirement. The book introduces this fascinating concept of the hundred-eyed Argus.
Oh, from Greek mythology.
Yeah, exactly. Argus was this giant whose body was covered in eyes, which allowed him to see in every direction simultaneously.
Right.
And the idea is, if you cultivate an observant Argus-like mind, you can actually find the last 3 centuries surviving right in your own local vicinity.
Just layered right there.
Exactly. Layered almost like geological strata in a sheer cliff face.
Yeah.
You can find preserved layers of, say, 18th century sentiment in the stoicism of certain families.
Or 16th century tribalism in circumscribed communities, like people living in really isolated mountain valleys. The past is still breathing right next to you if you simply know how to look for the strata.
That's the theory, yeah.
But I have to challenge the universality of that, honestly, because living in the modern world, especially for you if you're in a dense urban center, those geological layers of history feel completely paved over.
Well, the book actually addresses that stark contrast.
Because you aren't going to find deep, beautifully preserved historical strata in a modern metropolis. The book mentions environments like Berlin, where man comes into the world washed out and sapless.
Sapless, yeah. It's a harsh critique.
But think about what modern city living actually does to our psychology. It's an engine of cultural homogenization.
Oh, for sure.
The distinct textured layers of human history are just erased by this frantic, flat present. The architecture, the transit, the digital noise, it all flattens time.
You lose that layered self.
Right, leaving only a thin veneer of the immediate present.
But that flattening is precisely why the book insists we must look deeper into the strata that still govern our internal architecture.
Okay, so if we dig beneath that modern urban veneer, what do we hit?
The most massive, imposing layer of psychological history we inevitably hit is religion, specifically Christianity.
And the perspective the book takes here is incredibly nuanced, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. It presents this stark duality, framing Christianity simultaneously as a soothing balm and a lethal poison.
A balm and a poison.
Yeah, it describes it as the religion of antiquity grown old. Imagine the Greco-Roman Empire in its absolute decay.
The imagery used in the book for that is visceral.
It really is. Juvenal's Rome is depicted as a poisonous toad with the eyes of Venus.
A toad with the eyes of Venus.
Yeah.
That is just a brilliant, grotesque image.
Right.
It perfectly captures a society that's bloated, toxic, and entirely exhausted by its own sensuality, yet...
Yet still possessing the seductive, hypnotic allure of ancient beauty.
Exactly.
It was a society born into spiritual slavery. Its ears and eyes were so full of the slime of excess that it could no longer hear the voice of reason.
So for that decaying Roman world, Christianity acted as a necessary balm.
Yes. The book calls it a melodious evening chime that allowed a dying epoch to end its life decently.
Because it offered them this concept of beings who were more soul than body.
Right. Shy, scurrying, kindly creatures looking toward a better ethereal life. To the exhausted, cynical Roman, that was a profound narcotic relief.
But I have to push back on the second half of this premise.
What?
While it may have been a balm to a dying Rome, the argument follows that it was an absolute poison to the young, fresh animal soul of the barbarian Germans.
It was a shock to their system.
But from a historical standpoint, we're taught to view the Christianization of Europe as this massive civilizing force. How does the book justify calling it a sickness?
It calls it a sickness because of the specific psychological mechanism introduced to a culture that previously had no concept of it.
The concept of sin.
Exactly. You take the heroic, childlike, vital energy of the Germanic tribes, and you implant the psychological teaching of profound, inescapable sinfulness and eternal damnation.
And the result is described in the book as an enormous chemical fermentation and decomposition.
That's the exact phrase. It fundamentally weakened those fresh stocks of humanity. It turned their outward vitality inward into guilt and self-loathing.
Which raises a lingering, really uncomfortable historical question.
What's that?
Without that specific poisoning, without that internal weakening, would those raw barbarians have simply wiped the slate clean?
Oh, I see where you're going.
Would they have just eradicated all of Greek and Roman culture in their conquests? The uncomfortable suggestion in the book is that this very poisoning, this induced psychological sickness, was the strange, necessary mechanism that preserved the cultured past of the human race.
Which brings us to a chilling realization about the architecture of belief itself.
Right, moving from the historical impact to the raw mechanics of faith.
We have to confront how faith generates real-world power entirely, regardless of whether the object of that faith is true.
The book uses the obsession with witches as an example.
A perfect example. Witches, as supernatural entities, did not exist. But the terrible, very real effects of the belief in witches, the trials, the tortures, the restructuring of community trust.
They were exactly the same as if witches had actually existed.
Exactly. The psychological architecture of faith shapes empires, completely regardless of the objective reality of the doctrine.
And this is perfectly encapsulated by that story in the book, The Tragicomedy of Regensburg.
Yes, a fascinating historical moment.
The fate of modern German history, the very possibility of peaceful settlement without catastrophic religious wars, literally hung on a theological squabble over justification by grace.
Right, Martin Luther suspected the Italians who agreed with him were playing a diplomatic trick.
So he hindered the peace. But the profound tragedy, or comedy, depending on the darkness of your humor, is that none of the principles they were debating have any connection to truth.
None at all. Neither original sin nor redemption by proxy correspond to any physical things or realities.
It's the exact same mechanism as a modern political debate over phantom issues on the internet.
Oh, absolutely.
You have millions of people ready to tear society apart, severing relationships with family members over opinions on ideological constructs that correspond to absolutely nothing real.
The world was literally set on fire by theological concepts in the 16th century, simply because those concepts generated massive social force.
They were engines of pure power, entirely disconnected from truth.
And, when the absolute psychological grip of that religious dogma began to collapse, society abhorred the vacuum.
The sheer force of belief had to be replaced by something.
And it was. The modern state and its socio-political machinery stepped seamlessly into the exact psychological groove left behind by the church.
This dynamic is explored in the book through the concept of carrying coals to Newcastle.
Right. Now, for those who might not know the idiom.
Carrying coals to Newcastle basically means engaging in a completely pointless, redundant exercise because Newcastle is already a coal mining town. You're bringing a resource to a place that already has an abundance of it.
Precisely. And the book argues that large governments act with the exact same redundancy.
Oh, so?
They keep populations dependent, maintaining fear and obedience, by adding structure to societies that already have natural social gravity. And they do this using two primary tools.
The coarse tool and the refined tool.
Exactly. The coarse tool is the army, the threat of physical force. But the refined tool, the far more insidious method of control, is the school.
Let's really break down the terrifying subtlety of that school trap because it dictates the entire trajectory of modern life. For you, for me, for everyone listening.
It's everywhere.
The state deliberately puts obstacle after obstacle in front of private, independent education. It does this to monopolize educational posts.
It transforms the intellectual development of a society into a casino.
A casino where the only valid chips are standardized exams and state-sanctioned titles.
And here's the mechanism of control. The state ensures these teaching and bureaucratic posts pay meagerly.
It's the golden handcuffs of middle management.
It's a deliberate psychological mechanism designed to foster moderate discontent and a feverish thirst for promotion.
Moderate discontent. That is the exact phrase, and it is the fulcrum of state control, isn't it?
It really is. Think about it. If a population is starving, they will revolt and burn the system to the ground.
Right.
But if a population is totally content, they are free, courageous, and impossible to command.
So you have to hit that sweet spot.
Exactly. If you keep them moderately discontent, constantly chasing a 3% raise, a slightly better title, a marginally larger office, they become entirely attached to the views and stability of the government.
They are too invested to rebel and too unsatisfied to be free.
It creates a physically and mentally bridled body of citizens.
Imperceptibly imbued with the idea that only a career hallmarked by the state can lead to social distinction.
But the host of issues this creates doesn't stop there.
No, it doesn't. Because how does this structured low-grade discontent eventually curdle into the kind of societal rage that produces movements like socialism?
The book makes an incredibly bold claim about the origins of that rage.
It asserts that the only true remedy against socialism lies in the hands of the wealthy bourgeoisie, the liberal elite.
They must conquer themselves, because they are the ones who created the enemy.
Which is such a counterintuitive way to look at it. Socialism is framed in the book not merely as a political movement, but as an epidemic bred by the spurious, histrionic lavishness of the wealthy.
Right. It is not the mere existence of well-being that causes the societal fracture.
It's the performance of it.
Exactly. It is wealth used purely for show, specifically designed to provoke envy.
The noisy, operatic enthusiasm of the elite, the gilded houses, the performative exclusivity.
It's all driven by the quiet joy the wealthy get from knowing others lack what they have.
So if you possess significant wealth and you fear the uprising of the working class, you must realize that your own inclination, your own provocative display of possessions is what breathes life into the assailant.
And masking all of this, deafening us to the true machinations of the state and the elite, is the press.
The book's critique of the press is scathing. It calls it an everlasting false alarm.
We assume the media exists to inform us, but its daily expenditure of lung power is meant to bawl, to deafen, to excite, and to terrify.
It purposefully leads your ears and wits in a false direction. It hides the truly great political transactions that glide stealthily in the background while you are distracted by the noise.
And as we scale down from these massive macro structures, from the state, the bourgeoisie, the press, we must turn the lens painfully inward.
Right, because just as institutions wear masks to hide their craving for control, we wear intricate psychological masks in our daily interpersonal lives.
Consider the hyper-specific mechanics of conversational vanity.
Think about the last conversation you had with a stranger or maybe a colleague you wanted to impress. You didn't present your raw, unedited self.
No one does.
You carefully curated your thoughts, you casually dropped the name of a respected acquaintance, or found a way to smoothly mention an impressive project you just completed.
We generally call this putting our best foot forward.
But the underlying argument in the book is that this is not pride. It is the polite mask of pride.
You want to appear merely vain to avoid appearing dangerously proud.
It's a really subtle curation of identity.
It is a complex camouflage, and the inverse mechanism is equally fascinating.
Impoliteness.
Yes. The book notes that impoliteness is often the sign of a clumsy modesty.
Wait, really? Impoliteness is modesty.
I know it sounds backwards, but think about someone who loses their head when taken by surprise. They might act rudely, snapping at you or dismissing a topic, simply to hide their profound internal awkwardness.
Oh, I see. Their rudeness is just a shield for their vulnerability.
Exactly.
But wait, what about people who are incredibly intelligent or successful? Do the truly exceptional individuals operate this way? You would think true greatness transcends the need for these petty masks.
Counterintuitively, the book argues the highly successful are the best concealers of all.
Really?
They are profoundly cunning in making their actual faults and weaknesses look like manifestations of deliberate strength.
They map their own defects uncommonly well and just incorporate them into their persona.
Furthermore, the true sage, the person of profound rational depth, must often pretend to be a fool.
Pretend to be a fool.
Yes. They will feign excitement over a trivial matter or pretend to be enraged by a common annoyance. And they do this not because they actually feel those emotions, but out of a strange, isolating philanthropy.
A philanthropy? Wait, because their true nature is too cold?
Exactly. If a truly rational mind revealed the absolute coldness, the detached observation of their actual inner state, it would deeply hurt and alienate the people around them.
So they wear the mask of emotional superficiality just to protect everyday people from the abyss of their depth.
It's an act of mercy in a way.
That dynamic plays directly into what the book considers the main transgression against the vain, and this is a psychological chess match you are likely engaged in every single day without realizing the stake.
It happens all the time.
If you give someone the opportunity to show off their knowledge, if you graciously step back, keep quiet, and let them hold court on a topic they love, you probably think you're being kind and attentive.
You think you're being a good listener.
Right. But there is a subtle violence happening. By deliberately creating the space for them to perform, you are secretly asserting yourself as their superior.
You are acting as the magnanimous king granting an audience to a subject.
And unless that person already views you as a completely superior being, this forced, curated gratification of their vanity will subconsciously feel like an attack.
This invisible power struggle is exactly why the dynamics of friendship require such careful navigation. The book warns that the man of leisure is a grave danger to his friends.
Because he has nothing of substance to do, so his energy metastasizes.
He interferes, he gossips, he becomes a dangerous, idle nuisance.
The clever individual will strictly make friends with the industrious because the industrious are simply too busy to engage in the destructive, petty vanity of idle socializing.
So we have peeled back the layers. We dug through the geological strata of historical religion.
We stripped away the redundant architecture of the state, the deafening noise of the press, and the performative wealth of the elite.
We unmasked the petty vanities and power struggles of our daily conversations.
And what is actually left at the center? You are finally left with the naked, often highly idealized self.
And to illustrate the profound complexity of this inner core, the book looks at the mechanics of Goethe's genius.
Goethe serves as a signal exception among great artists, but precisely because of his errors, right?
Yes. His greatness did not emerge from staying safely within his natural competency. He harbored an agonizing, scorching, secret desire to be a plastic artist, like a sculptor or painter.
And later in life, he convinced himself he was a great scientific discoverer.
These were objectively fundamental errors about his own core identity. He was a poet.
But the vital mechanism here is that without the extravagances of those specific errors, he would not have been Goethe.
Exactly, because he was desperately trying to view the world with the eyes of a painter. He wasn't just thinking about rhyme and meter. He was obsessing over light, shadow, and physical form.
He forced a visual artist's desperation into a poet's vocabulary.
His idealized vision of himself, even though factually incorrect, is exactly what infused his poetry with such a timeless, tactile connection to nature.
His error produced his genius.
But holding on to an idealized vision of yourself, especially when it is reflected back at you by society, is agonizing.
The book says the most painful feeling that exists is being involuntarily idealized.
Imagine you were taken for something higher, something more moral, pure, or disciplined than you actually are.
When that projection occurs, you are forced to confess to yourself that there is a deceitful something in your nature.
Your calm expression, your quiet bearing, your measured speech.
This deceitful something is doing the heavy lifting, destroying the value of your usual honesty. You realize that to maintain the ideal that society has built for you, you must become an active liar to yourself and the world.
And sitting with that realization brings you to a profound psychological precipice.
The danger of renunciation.
Yes. You might observe all of this, the masks, the vanity, the state control, the deceitful idealization, and decide the only moral action is to strip it all away.
You decide to renounce all the joys of society. You reject the honors, the creature comforts, the polite, empty conversations, all in a desperate bid to find absolute, naked wisdom.
But there is a calm, terrifying warning waiting for you in the text.
If you base your life on too narrow a foundation, if you repudiate everything human, all too human, you might arrive at the end of your long journey only to find that you have not achieved wisdom at all.
You've merely achieved a bitter, exhausting satiety of life. You hollow yourself out in the pursuit of truth and find only emptiness.
It forces you into a brutal landscape referred to in the book as cannibal country.
The choice presented to you is stark and unavoidable.
In solitude, you are eaten up by yourself. Among crowds, you are eaten up by the many.
There is no escape from consumption. You must simply choose which teeth you prefer.
Which brings us to the final, unsettling strategy for navigating this existence, learning how to suffer in public.
The book advises that you must actively advertise your misfortunes.
When you are inconvenienced, you must audibly sigh. You must ensure the world sees the visible, daily marks of your impatience, your stress, and your pain.
The evolutionary psychology behind this strategy is brilliant and deeply cynical.
Why must you perform your suffering?
Because if the people around you, your friends, your colleagues, your society, knew how assured and happy you truly are in the hidden, quiet depths of your soul, in spite of all your physical privations, they would become viciously envious.
And envy is the most destructive social force.
If they saw your true invulnerability, your internal peace, they would feel diminished by it.
And they would unconsciously levy a heavy, punitive toll upon you to bring you back down to their level of anxiety.
Which leaves you with a lingering, paranoid reality to examine the very next time you step out your door and interact with the world.
Are your public complaints, your performative sighs over your daily stresses, actually a cunning, necessary shield?
Are your public misfortunes secretly your greatest private advantage? You know, you can spend your entire life agonizing over your grand career mission or the metaphysical salvation of your soul, and yet you suffer daily, chronically, simply because you refuse to pay attention to the exact temperature of the room you sleep in.
Right. It's a profound disconnect.
It is. We walk around claiming, rather hypocritically, that we only eat to live. We elevate these massive abstract concepts, the advancement of science, universal truth, while completely ignoring the simplest laws of our own bodies.
And the book presents a rather ruthless critique of this. It calls out this simulated, almost theatrical contempt for the everyday. We neglect the mundane matters of eating, housing, and clothing in favor of what it calls the metaphysical.
Yeah, and the book details exactly how this manifests in, well, highly specific, almost absurdly overlooked ways.
The examples are striking. It observes that people will go their entire lives eating eggs without ever realizing that the oblong ones actually possess the best flavor.
I mean, who even thinks to notice that?
Exactly. Or they remain entirely unaware that atmospheric pressure specifically, the electrical charge of an approaching thunderstorm, physically aids in their own digestion.
Wow.
Or consider how often people actively ruin their own digestive process by talking too much or even listening too intently during a meal. The energy required for deep intellectual listening is literally siphoned away from the physical mechanics of the stomach.
Okay, let's unpack this because it sounds trivial at first glance, but it's really not. Think about it like this. You spend decades trying to unlock the purpose of the universe, but you suffer daily because you don't pay attention to the pace at which you chew your food.
Yes, and these trivialities are actually symptoms of a profound self-inflicted blindness. The consequence is severe. This arrogant neglect of the human for the supposed benefit of humanity leads directly to spiritual and bodily infirmities.
We render ourselves weak.
We do. We make ourselves entirely dependent on an external apparatus. We need physicians to heal the bodies we refuse to understand. We need teachers to instruct us on how to live, and clergymen to soothe the profound anxieties that result from this disconnect.
Because we refuse to observe ourselves. And if we're that blind to the physical mechanics of our daily lives, it naturally extends to our internal world.
Precisely. If we can't even recognize how a thunderstorm affects our stomach, how can we possibly trust our perception of human agency? We are entirely deluded about the mental mechanics of our choices.
Which brings us right into the book's dismantling of free will.
Yes. The doctrine of free will, according to the book, is not some transcendent truth. It's an invention, specifically an invention formulated by the ruling classes.
Wait, really? By the ruling classes?
Yes, because a person feels free wherever their vitality is strongest. For one person, that immense vitality might reside in their passions. For another, it's in their strict sense of duty. For a third, it's in their logical conscience.
So wherever our capacity is greatest, we just falsely assume we're acting without constraint.
Exactly. The book argues that free will is simply the absence of feeling new chains.
The absence of new chains. I mean, I have a hard time accepting that premise without some resistance. If I sit here right now and deliberately choose to drink coffee instead of tea, you're saying that isn't a free choice. It feels entirely autonomous to me.
It feels autonomous because you are completely accustomed to the chains dictating that choice. We are always dependent. We're bound by a vast web of prior causes, biological imperatives, historical conditioning. But through the repetitive friction of daily existence, we just no longer feel the weight of our current chains.
We only notice when a new restriction is added.
Right. When no new restriction is placed on you when you choose the coffee because your biology, your sleep habits, and your cultural conditioning all subtly align to make that choice inevitable, you proudly declare yourself free.
That introduces a really fascinating complication regarding how we view human action. The book places a lot of blame for this illusion on what it calls the isolation of facts.
The atomic theory of volition, yes.
Yeah, we inaccurately observe life as a series of distinct, isolated actions with these vast, empty vacuums of nothingness between them. And language tricks us into this.
Words deceive us.
They do. Here's where it gets really interesting. Think of human action as a continuous, rushing river. Believing in free will is essentially like scooping out a single cup of water, isolating it entirely from the current, the gravity, the rainfall that created it, and then judging that isolated cup of water as if it moved entirely on its own accord.
That analogy captures the absurdity perfectly. But we have to ask why we so desperately cling to this illusion. Why do we insist the cup of water moves itself?
Why do we?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, human beings possess a profound psychological need to believe they are the eternal wonder worker. We need to see ourselves as the super beast of creation.
The super beast, I love that term.
It's crucial. We need to believe we operate outside the deterministic laws of physics and biology that govern everything else. We require this illusion to derive our psychical pleasure and pain.
Because if we accept that our actions are just the inevitable flow of that rushing river,
then our guilt, our pride, our tragic and heroic gestures all become a kind of cosmic joke. Without the illusion of free will, the entire theatrical production of human exceptionalism just collapses.
which forces us to confront a terrifying logical conclusion. If we falsely isolate these actions, and if this fervent belief in free will is just a psychological mechanism to feel like the super beast, then we've built an entire societal structure of judgment and punishment upon a fundamental logical fallacy.
We absolutely have. The entire justice system is constructed on a myth. It's an architecture of profound paradox.
Especially when you look at the roles of the judge and the criminal.
Exactly. Think about it. A judge punishes an offender based on the explicit claim that the criminal used their free will to intentionally reject better motives. The logic is that reason and law presented a clear, better path, and the criminal miraculously chose the worse path.
Miraculously being the key word there.
Right, because if the deed truly resulted from absolute free will, meaning it intervened as a pure miracle, without any prior motive, without any biological drive or environmental constraint, how can it possibly be punished?
You can't. To punish a truly causeless act, an act without a history, is completely absurd.
It is. The whole system of judicial retribution is what the book calls a marvelous conceptual mythology.
I am always struck by the incredible discrepancy in knowledge between the one judging and the one being judged. The criminal understands the entire dense chain of circumstances, the economic pressures, the biological impulses, the personal histories leading up to that exact moment.
They know the river.
They know the river. But the judge, looking from the outside, measures the severity of the punishment largely by their own degree of astonishment that such an act could occur.
And astonishment is simply a byproduct of ignorance.
Yes, a good defense lawyer's job isn't to deny the act, it's simply to explain that history, to fill in the vacuums between those isolated facts, until the judge's astonishment fades and they realize the crime was nothing but eternal necessity.
Furthermore, the application of this punishment reveals its own internal contradictions. Look at how society treats habitual criminals. We instinctively punish habitual offenders more severely.
Right, like a three-strikes law.
Exactly. Yet logically, if a behavior is a deep-seated habit, that propensity is actually much harder to resist. Habit makes the action more determined, more deeply ingrained in the causal chain.
Oh, wow. So under the logic of free will, a habitual act should be more excusable, not less.
Precisely, because the individual's freedom to choose otherwise is severely diminished by repetition. To be truly logical, we would have to punish the criminal's parents, their teachers, and the entirety of society that forged those chains.
But society doesn't do that.
No, because society doesn't actually punish for moral reasons. The moral veneer is a comforting fiction. Society punishes to maintain its own power and equilibrium. This reveals the true, unromantic origin of justice.
If justice isn't a universal moral truth handed down from the heavens, then we have to look at what it actually functions as. It forces us to look at primitive power dynamics.
Yes. The book traces justice back to the concept of equilibrium.
Right. It posits that communities originally formed simply as an organization of the weak. The weak banded together to counterbalance threatening forces like robbers or warlords. They grouped their small weights together on the scales of survival to equal the massive, singular weight of an oppressor.
Justice, therefore, is merely the maintenance of this hard-won equilibrium. We misunderstand the ancient concept of an eye for an eye. We think it's about blind, raging anger.
But it's not.
It's not. It is a calculated, almost mathematical way to restore disturbed power relations. If you take my eye, you have tipped the scale of power in your favor. You compromise the equilibrium of the community. By taking your eye in return, I restore the balance.
It's just weights on a scale. Disgrace, fines, imprisonment. They aren't moral cleansings. They are counterweights thrown onto the communal scales to offset the temporary advantage a criminal gained.
And this mathematical approach to power is brilliantly applied to the concept of revenge.
Oh, the dissection of revenge in the book is masterful. It shows that revenge is a pocket word. It's a single word stuffed with entirely different mechanisms that we just lazily lump together.
It outlines two very distinct types.
Right. Type 1 is the defensive counterblow. This is pure instinctual self-preservation. Imagine a machine you're operating suddenly jams and violently pinches your hand. In a flash of pain, you forcefully strike the machine.
You aren't striking it to teach the gears a moral lesson.
No. You strike it just to make it stop hurting you. It's a desperate, reflexive bid to halt the injury. But contrast that with Type 2, which operates on an entirely different psychological plane.
Type 2 is the intentional readjustment.
Yes, you don't strike out of immediate fear or a need to stop a current attack. The attack is already over. You strike to prove the absolute absence of fear, specifically to restore wounded honor.
This is the cold, dangerous logic of the duel.
Exactly. The physical injury might be minimal, but the balance of respect has been tipped. So what does this all mean for you? Think about it. When you snap back at a colleague who subtly insults you in a meeting, what is actually driving that reaction? Are you acting out of type 1 self-preservation, a frantic fear of further social injury, lashing out reflexively like striking the jammed machine?
Or are you engaging in type 2? The cold, calculating readjustment of your personal honor to prove to the rest of the room that you cannot be intimidated.
It's rarely a moral crusade for truth. It's almost always weight management on the scales of social power.
And this relentless desire to maintain equilibrium doesn't just create our legal justice system. It breeds the dark, unspoken social emotions that govern all our interactions. This is the shadow of society.
In the shadow.
Yes. Consider malicious joy, commonly known as schadenfreude. The book details how this arises when a prosperous person, someone standing slightly higher on the social ladder, suddenly suffers a misfortune. We feel a distinct spark of joy because their suffering mechanically lowers them back down to our level.
It restores the mathematical equality. It eases the tension of our own inferiority.
Precisely.
I always struggle to reconcile that with how we typically view envy. I mean, we usually assume envy is the bitter result of extreme inequality. But the logic presented here is incredibly counterintuitive.
Yeah.
Envy is only possible because of equality.
It's a brilliant insight. In a rigid caste system where a peasant believes a king is practically a different biological species, the peasant doesn't envy the king. The distance is too vast.
Envy requires a baseline assumption that we should be equal.
Right. When we are ostensibly equal, but someone suddenly pulls ahead, we possess a deep urge to depress them back down to the common level. The book refers to this as the envy of the gods, which strikes when someone, like a highly victorious general, outgrows their rank.
Society cannot tolerate an equal becoming too unequal. The equilibrium is threatened.
And observe what happens when a community finally achieves universal peace and security. When the external threat of destruction is gone, that old, violent, suppressed instinct for predominance doesn't just vanish, it morphs.
It sprouts as vanity.
Yes. Vanity is an antisocial aftergrowth. It is the obsession with dress, with intricate manners, with professional titles and minor privileges. It's the safe, domesticated way we try to claw our way above our equals when physical violence is outlawed.
We replace the physical club with a status symbol, but the drive for dominance remains identical.
Absolutely identical.
And even our highest virtues are aggressively policed by this need for equilibrium. There's that fascinating section on the virtues that damage us. Society actually forbids us from exercising truly noble virtues, like extreme grace or profound indulgence toward miscreants.
If you, as an individual, decide to completely and unconditionally forgive someone who robbed the community, society will condemn you.
Why? Because your radical forgiveness harms the community's collective advantage. It sabotages its deterrent systems. True grace is characterized in the book as a ruler's virtue. It's closely akin to pride. Only someone so immensely powerful that they cannot possibly be threatened can afford to be truly gracious.
For the rest of us mere equals, extreme virtue is viewed as a social threat, a disruption of the scales. And what's fascinating here is the clinical detachment of this analysis. These emotions, schadenfreude, envy, vanity, they are not judged as evil in the traditional moral sense.
Right, they're just dissected as necessary mathematical formulas for human survival.
Exactly. To deeply understand your own reactions, you must be willing to look directly at this shadow. You cannot just bask in the flattering, artificial light of our presumed nobility.
And to truly see this stark reality, to dissect the illusion of free will, to accept the mechanical nature of punishment, to admit to our petty vanities, requires stepping completely away from the deafening noise of the living. It requires conversing with the shadows.
The author describes a philosophical journey to Hades.
He does. He states that he sacrifices his own blood to converse with 4 specific pairs of dead souls, these great minds of the past: Epicurus and Montaigne, Goethe and Spinoza, Plato and Rousseau, Pascal and Schopenhauer.
He fastens his eyes on those 8, and he sees their eyes fastened on him in return. And compared to the eternal vigor and unyielding clarity of these dead minds, the living seem pale, fretful, and endlessly distracted.
It's a profound acknowledgement that true insight often requires retreating from the frantic, unthinking rush of contemporary society, just to commune with the hardened, timeless truths discovered by those who came before.
It is only in this quiet, isolated space that we find the dialogue between the wanderer and his shadow.
And in that dialogue, the shadow finally speaks. It reveals a crucial perspective. It is not an opponent to the light. It's a necessary, intimate friend.
For the existence of beauty, for clearness of speech, for firmness of character, The shadow is just as necessary as the light. They hold hands.
The shadow hates the darkness of the night just as much as the wanderer does. The shadow loves the gleam of human eyes when they are in the active pursuit of discovering knowledge. You cannot cast a sharp, defining shadow without a brilliant, penetrating light of inquiry.
We must accept the less flattering, deterministic aspects of our nature to achieve any real intellectual maturity. The book notes that an intellect containing a few worms does not detract from its ripeness.
Right. An apple can be perfectly ripe, deeply sweet, and still have a worm inside. We have to accept the worms, the flaws, the mechanical dependencies, and the shadows within our own minds. If we demand absolute, unblemished purity in our motives, we're demanding a childish fantasy.
We are refusing to see the mechanics of the clock.
Which brings us to a rather sudden, thought-provoking pivot regarding the very foundation of our daily happiness. The philosophy outlines what it calls the philosophy that society always needs. If you look at the towering pillars of our entire social structure, you might naturally assume they rest on justice or divine truth or mutual cooperation.
But the argument presented is that society actually rests upon a single fundamental lie: the cheerful philosophy of contentment.
A load-bearing mass delusion.
Exactly. Society only functions because almost everyone, despite the grinding reality of their existence, contemplates their sickness, their poverty, their daily struggles, or their profound cosmic insignificance, and ultimately says to themselves, "After all, I would not change places with anyone."
If everyone clearly saw the mechanical absurdity of their position, the utter lack of free will, the arbitrary nature of justice, and the stark reality of their suffering, they would revolt. They would tear the structure down in despair.
But this artificially implanted cheerfulness, this stubborn refusal to change places with another, acts as the mortar holding the bricks of civilization together.
So if our justice, our morality, and our deeply held belief in free will are all illusions meticulously designed to keep us from tearing each other apart, is your personal contentment with your own life just the final necessary delusion keeping the social structure from collapsing?
Think about the last time you did something purely out of the goodness of your heart. Maybe you helped a stranger, or forgave a slight, or, sacrificed your own time for someone else's benefit.
Right, that warm, profound feeling of goodness.
Exactly. Now imagine if I told you that very impulse, that exact feeling, was originally born from sheer, desperate selfishness.
It's a rather uncomfortable threshold the book forces us across right from the very start.
It really is. I mean, it completely strips away all the romanticism we instinctively attach to morality. If you trace human behavior back far enough into primitive society, the actions we now revere as deeply moral didn't begin with any grand virtuous intent at all.
No, not at all. They were performed purely for survival. We're talking about a shared, really desperate need for the common advantage.
Raw utility.
Yes, raw utility. In those brutal early days, you acted in a certain way because if you didn't, the entire community might just perish. I mean, you didn't share your food because it was quote-unquote good in some cosmic sense.
Right, you shared it so the hunter next to you wouldn't starve, because you needed his spear tomorrow.
Exactly. But over generations, that raw, practical utility, it morphed. People kept performing these same actions, but the fundamental motivations shifted entirely.
They shifted to fear of the group, or, to simple habit, because they'd seen these actions performed since childhood.
Or even to vanity, really, because society began to praise those actions.
And this leads to what I find to be the most quietly devastating insight in the book. The idea that these actions are only considered moral today because that original, calculating motive of utility has been completely forgotten.
The oblivion of utility.
The oblivion of utility, yes. It is literally this amnesia that gives birth to the moral sentiment as we feel it right now. Let's just sit with that for a moment.
It's heavy. Society, in order to survive at all, had to battle the localized, short-sighted selfishness of the individual so fiercely and for so long that it structurally began to rate every other motive morally higher than utility.
It had to make calculations seem selfish.
It had to. Think about the profound friction of those early human communities. I mean, if every individual only acts when they can consciously calculate a personal advantage, the community is entirely unstable. It fractures.
So society forces the individual to submit to the collective without question.
Right. And because of this long, fierce battle, society now harbors a deeply ingrained hatred for actions done with a conscious purpose of utility.
We've collectively forgotten that morality, in its purest, most original form, was literally nothing more than public utility struggling to prevail over individual interests.
It fundamentally changes how you look at the people around you, doesn't it? Especially when the book introduces this fascinating concept of inherited moral wealth.
Oh, the inherited moral wealth. Yes. You, listening right now, likely know people who are just naturally gentle, they're good-tempered, compassionate. They seem to navigate the world with this effortless kindness.
And the book suggests they've simply inherited their ancestors' gentle mode of action.
But, and this is a massive, really unsettling caveat, they have not inherited the common sense, the sheer, cold, calculating utility that originally generated that gentleness.
That is the crux of it. I mean, they possess the artifact, but not the machinery that built it.
Right. Let me try to map this out with an analogy. Imagine you inherit a massive, sprawling financial fortune from a brilliant, hardworking, incredibly shrewd grandparent.
Okay.
You get the wealth, but you absolutely do not inherit their financial literacy. You don't know how the money was made.
You don't understand the bitter compromises.
Exactly. The ruthless negotiations, the cold calculations that built that empire, you just have the money. And without that exquisite intelligence to manage it, these morally wealthy people become what the book brilliantly terms spendthrifts of morality.
I love that phrase so much, spendthrifts of morality, because it paints such a vivid picture of how dangerous unexamined goodness can actually be.
They throw their compassion around blindly.
They do. They abandon themselves to their conciliatory instincts without any restraint or any strategic thought. And the book points out that by doing so, they actually make everyone around them more careless.
More covetous and more sentimental.
Right. Their unguided, inherited goodness becomes a sort of slow poison to the discipline of the community. They are spending the moral capital of their ancestors without generating any new stability.
It's a chillingly accurate psychological portrait, and it flows so seamlessly into the book's radical definition of the conscience itself.
Oh, absolutely.
We're conditioned, almost from birth really, to think of the conscience as something sacred. We treat it as the voice of God whispering in the heart.
A divine spark of inherent truth that tells us right from wrong.
Exactly. But the book strips that away completely. It argues that the conscience is simply the sum total of demands placed upon us in childhood, without reason, by people we feared or respected.
It is the echo of childhood authority, nothing more. I mean, when you feel that heavy, sinking sense of obligation, that inner voice that dictates, this I must do, this I must omit, notice that it doesn't ask why.
No, it doesn't.
The feeling of conscience is intrinsically authoritative and blind. The book makes a really fascinating distinction here. The moment you ask why, or the moment you act with a because, you're actually acting without conscience.
Let's unpack that because it sounds almost counterintuitive to modern ears. Acting with a because means acting without conscience.
Yes, because you're employing logic. You're using your own reasoning rather than submitting to the ingrained echo of authority.
Ah.
It doesn't mean you're acting against your conscience necessarily. You might still do the quote-unquote right thing, but the mechanism has changed. The belief in authority is the sole source of conscience.
It's not the voice of God and man. It is merely the voice of some men and man, reverberating down through the corridors of your early development. That echoing voice of authority, it brings us to a fascinating threshold. If conscience and morality are essentially just these inherited habits of utility and deeply ingrained localized authority, how does the book explain human behavior at the absolute edges?
What do you mean by the edges?
What happens when you step outside the boundaries where those rules of utility or fear apply?
Ah, right. You look at our intercourse with animals. The book examines this specific relationship to reveal the exact limits of our inherited morality.
Because there's no communal advantage there.
Right. Where there's no advantage to be gained or no fear of retaliation, humans display a staggering lack of responsibility. Imagine you're sitting on a porch on a sultry summer day. A small insect crawls across the armrest. You might mindlessly crush it with your thumb without a second thought, without a single ripple of moral hesitation.
It is the cruelty of thoughtlessness.
Exactly. But contrast that with our treatment of a domestic animal like a cow or a horse. Subtly, we practice care. We legislate against cruelty.
And why is that? The book argues it's not out of some innate universal morality that extends to all living things.
No, it's because of primitive communal morality. In an early agrarian society, if a man hurts his cow, he threatens the community's agriculture.
He threatens the meat supply.
Right. Furthermore, he awakens the suspicion that he might also be harsh to weak men, making him a wild card.
But there is another layer the book points out, isn't there? Superstition.
Yes, superstition. Early religions taught us to imagine human and divine souls dwelling within certain animals. This bred a reverential awe.
So even centuries after the literal superstition fades into myth, the sentiments awakened by it continue to blossom and dictate our modern kindness to those specific animals.
It is all still rooted in that ancient, forgotten calculus of utility, fear, and awe.
But what happens when that calculus completely fails? When the mild habits of morality and the subtle, unspoken fears of the community just aren't enough to protect the Commonwealth from genuinely destructive individuals?
The book makes a grim, unflinching observation here.
It states that when the propensity towards the perverse and the personal persists, when someone simply will not yield to the communal utility, the most terrible means of intimidation must be brought into play.
And we have to ask, what is the ultimate, most terrible means of intimidation ever devised by the human mind?
The invention of a hereafter with a hell everlasting.
Exactly.
Yes.
Let's really consider the quiet weight of that. When earthly racks, prisons, and physical tortures were no longer sufficient to enforce the communal rules, society had to invent tortures of the soul.
It is a profound escalation. It's moving the enforcement of utility from the physical realm, which has limits, to the psychological and eternal realm, which has none.
Hell is designed specifically to maintain the community on a certain plane of behavior when milder, more rational forms of preservation proved utterly ineffective. It is the ultimate brute force instrument of moral preservation.
I have to pause here, though, because as you, the listener, contemplate this incredibly cold view of human motivation, you might be thinking, well, what about pure pity? Unadulterated compassion for the suffering of another human being. Surely the book, which looks so deeply and quietly into human motivation, views pity as a genuinely noble, non-utilitarian emotion.
That is exactly where the book's framework is most ruthlessly consistent, and perhaps most challenging to accept. It dissects pity and reveals something deeply unsettling.
Which is?
The expression of pity, the book argues, is actually regarded as a sign of contempt.
Contempt. Explain the mechanics of that. How does feeling sorry for someone equate to contempt?
It has to do with the equilibrium of human interaction. The moment someone becomes an object of your pity, they have clearly ceased to be an object of your fear.
Oh, wow.
They have sunk below the baseline where they can affect you, challenge you, or harm you. Human vanity, as the book describes it, is a fragile thing.
It's only truly satisfied by the feeling that one is imposing respect and awe upon others.
Right. So pity requires the suffering, the degradation of another person to even exist. It requires them to be lesser than you.
So if I am pitying you, I am subconsciously celebrating the fact that I am safe from you. I am above you.
Exactly. This is why the book describes the philosophy that derives all morality from pity as the unconscious pleader for human deterioration.
That's a heavy phrase.
It is, but its meaning is precise. For pity to thrive as a moral supreme, it structurally requires an endless supply of suffering. It feeds on the loss of awe. It demands that people be broken so that the pitier can exercise their virtue.
It is a morality that secretly wishes for the world to remain sick.
Yes.
This quiet dissection of human vanity and fear flows so powerfully into how the book unpacks the daily psychological mechanics of religion. I mean, once you understand hell as a brutal tool of moral enforcement, you start looking at the softer, everyday rituals differently.
Like prayer.
Take prayer, for instance. The book offers a brilliant, almost mathematical critique of prayer. It notes that prayer only makes logical sense on two hypotheses.
Either you believe you can actually alter the will of the Godhead, which implies God's will is malleable, perhaps even flawed.
Or the devotee knows better than God what they actually need.
An Orthodox tradition firmly denies both of those hypotheses. The divine is all-wise, unchanging, and all-provident.
So the piercing question the book raises is, why on earth maintain the practice of prayer? If it cannot logically change the outcome without violating the core tenets of the faith, what is its function?
And the answer the book provides is what it calls the wisdom of the serpent. It is an absolute masterclass in psychological management by the early architects of faith.
Explain the wisdom of the serpent here.
Think about the psychological reality of the early believers. If an outright command was issued, banning prayer entirely, because it is logically incompatible with an omniscient deity, what would happen?
It would have led those followers straight into devastating, crushing boredom.
Exactly. They would be forced to sit in the terrifying, silent determinism of their religion, and boredom eventually leads to the denial of the religion itself.
So prayer was maintained as a psychological release valve.
It allowed them to essentially have a chat with the divine. It is profound in its simplicity. They could ask for pleasant things, unburdening their daily anxieties.
And feel a slight, comforting amusement at their own folly and still having wishes despite having an all-providing father.
Right. It wasn't about changing the mechanics of the universe. It was an admirable invention to keep the human mind occupied, emotionally tethered, and above all, submissive.
And it tethers them not just through emotional comfort, but through a total redefinition of guilt. This is where the book unpacks how religion completely unhinged worldly justice.
Yes, it did this by taking every earthly transgression, every theft, every act of violence, and turning it into a sin.
And a sin is framed not primarily as an outrage against the world or an outrage against your neighbor, but as a direct outrage against the divine.
The implications of that shift are staggering when you really map them out. If I harm you under worldly justice, I owe a debt to you and to the community.
But if religion steps in and declares my action a sin, suddenly the crime is against the divine. You, the victim, are almost sidelined in the cosmic accounting.
And crucially, because only the divine can see the true motives of the heart, the divine becomes the only true judge.
What does this do to human judges?
It renders them instantly hypocritical. It abolishes the absolute legitimacy of worldly justice. The human judge on the bench is just as culpable, just as saturated in sin before the divine as the condemned man standing before him.
It is a profound equalization through universal guilt. No human has the moral high ground anymore.
Yet within all this deep devotion and submission, the book points out a striking danger regarding personality.
It observes that people are far more fiercely attached to their own thought images of the divine than to the divine as an actual independent personality.
This is a subtle but crucial distinction. We craft a concept, a thought image of what the ultimate authority should be. It is usually comforting, predictable, and aligns with our own inherited moral wealth.
We sacrifice ourselves for our creation, our conceptual thought.
But a true, unpredictable personality disrupts the comfort of that thought image. The moment a supreme authority is viewed too much as a distinct personality with its own incomprehensible will, people begin to quarrel with it.
It's why the most pious of individuals eventually utter that bitter, desperate cry of being forsaken.
Right. They aren't forsaken by the divine. They're forsaken by the rigid thought image they constructed.
If we follow this thread, how deeply we are bound by our thought images, our conventions, our inherited structures of authority, we find a seamless transition in the book from the rules of society to the rules of art.
The book makes an explicit, fascinating link here. It states that the reasons for choosing between what it calls the grand style and a simple, easily understood style are inextricably bound up with morality.
The aesthetics of how we communicate are a direct reflection of our moral constraints.
We see this shift most clearly in the evolution of language and communication. The book argues that the age of good speaking is over.
Think of the era of the ancient city-state cultures, where a town crier or an orator had to be heard and understood by the whole assembled community in a single physical space.
That localized limit is gone. Now, to be what the book calls a good European hey, someone engaged in the broader intellectual landscape, one must learn to write, and to write well.
Because writing is the only mechanism capable of crossing the boundaries of nations and time. Better writing is not just an aesthetic flourish. The book insists it directly equates to better thinking.
It is the moral effort to make oneself comprehensible to the foreigner, to make the good common property rather than a localized secret.
Which brings us to one of the most beautiful, complex, and rewarding concepts in the entire book. The idea of dancing in chains.
Dancing in chains. When you look at the great classical artists, the poets, the writers, they didn't seek absolute formless freedom.
They willingly imposed severe, manifold constraints upon themselves.
Yes, they embraced inherited formulas, strict metrical laws, and rigid structures of epic narration.
Why would a genius actively seek to restrict their own movement?
Because convention is a shared language. It is the artistic means acquired for the understanding of the hearer. Imagine actual dancing.
Okay.
If you simply flail your limbs in complete freedom, it might feel expressive to you, but to the observer, it is chaos. It lacks meaning.
But if you accept the constraints of a waltz or a tango, if you accept the chains of convention, your audience knows exactly what movements you are making.
And more importantly, they can perceive when you do something extraordinary within those boundaries. You dance within those chains, and then slowly you invent a new constraint. imposing it upon yourself and cheerfully overcoming it.
So that the victory is perceived and admired by a public that shares your foundational language.
Exactly. And that shared language, that necessity of the chain, highlights the absolute folly of the modern craze for originality.
The book's critique here is incredibly piercing. By stubbornly avoiding conventions, by throwing off all the chains in the name of being utterly unique and authentic, modern artists are essentially expressing a desire not to be understood.
It is a false vanity. You offer something beyond convention of your own free will, hoping to be seen as a visionary. But if you abandon convention entirely, you destroy the bridge to your audience.
You might be marveled at, perhaps worshipped as a bizarre oddity, but you are seldom actually comprehended.
True mastery is the ability to be profoundly original while still speaking a language the listener can decipher.
This is where the book levels a truly brutal, highly specific critique at German prose.
It draws a sharp, unforgiving contrast. It claims that certain writers only know improvised prose.
They treat writing casually, letting themselves go, abandoning the rigorous chains of formal constraint. They write as they speak, which is to say, sloppily.
Whereas others, particularly the Italians and the French, the book notes, treat a page of prose as if they are sculpting a statue out of naked beauty.
People generally accept that verse, rhythm, and poetry require honest, painstaking effort. But the notion of meticulously working at a page of prose sounds like a fairy tale to the improvised mind.
The book issues a stark warning against authors who let themselves go in this manner. It describes the sheer exhaustion of reading an author who requires 50 pages to express 5 ideas.
It is an absolute agony for what the book calls the short-sighted reader. The reader who is earnestly trying to follow the thread but keeps getting lost in the mud of improvised thought.
The author is endangering the reader's vision, both literal and intellectual, without offering adequate compensation for the effort.
And so we arrive at this ultimate clarifying resolution for anyone seeking to master themselves or their craft.
The book states it with absolute, quiet certainty. Improving our style means improving our ideas and nothing else.
There is no separation between the two. The clarity of your thought is indistinguishable from the clarity of your expression.
You cannot hide a muddy, unformed idea behind a beautiful sentence, just as you cannot express a truly profound, crystalline idea in a sloppy, improvised manner.
To sharpen the pen is to sharpen the mind.
Which brings us to a final vital image the book offers.
An image you, listening right now, must hold in your mind as you navigate these dizzying concepts we've explored today. The inherited echoes of morality, the quiet cruelty of utility, the brutal enforcements of faith, and the necessary chains of art.
The book describes a terrifying landscape. Picture a place where torrents of water rush from every side into a steep, narrow ravine.
The movement of the water is so swift, so impossibly stormy, that it carries your eye along violently.
The wooded mountain slopes around you seem not just to sink, but to literally fly down into the abyss alongside the water. It creates an agonized, unbearable tension in the viewer.
You feel as if some hostile, unseen element is hidden behind it all, forcing everything, the water, the trees, the earth itself, to flee downward into the dark.
The book tells us that this landscape cannot be painted, and more importantly, it cannot be understood if you are standing down in the middle of it.
If you are on the banks of that ravine, you are overwhelmed by the noise, the spray, the sheer terror of the downward pull.
The only way to comprehend that landscape is if you hover above it, suspended like a bird in the open air, looking down in absolute stillness. The bird's eye view is not an artistic caprice here. It is the sole possibility of comprehension.
And so you must apply this to the rushing torrent of human history, to the terrifying, cascading evolution of our morals and our deepest vanities. You cannot understand this storm while you are standing in the middle of it, swept up in the immediate demands of your own inherited conscience.
You must find a way to hover above it, free from the heavy chains of your own moral wealth, and look down. Which leaves you with a deeply unsettling question for tomorrow. When you feel that next sudden pang of moral outrage, or that rush of pure, unadulterated pity for someone else, are you the bird looking down, objectively understanding the ancient machinery at work? Or are you just another rock, blinded by the spray, being swept blindly into the ravine? Which, completely shatters how we usually listen to Johann Sebastian Bach.
Oh, absolutely. It's not at all what you expect.
Right, because you aren't just sitting in a concert hall, absorbing these pretty arrangements of notes. The book argues that when you sit inside that immense counterpoint, you are viscerally experiencing what it felt like to be present at God's creation of the universe.
It's a very tectonic sensation.
Yes. Exactly. It's this overwhelming feeling that something magnificent and, like, monumental is currently in the making, but it's not yet fully formed. You actually feel the raw, structural plates of reality shifting into place.
Like they're still molten.
Yeah, still molten, still waiting for that final breath of life.
Well, look at where Bach actually stands on the historical timeline, to understand why that sensation even occurs. He is the ultimate threshold figure of modern European music. He is basically the bridge we all crossed.
But his orientation on that bridge is what the book finds so fascinating, right?
Exactly, because he is not staring eagerly into the modern era. His back is actually turned to it. He's looking squarely at the Middle Ages.
I mean, the book points out that Bach operated with what it terms a crude Christianity
Yeah.
and a crude scholasticism.
Right, he was laying down the mathematical and structural groundwork that would eventually allow modern music to conquer nationalities, the church, the entire globe. But his own architectural materials, his internal compass, really were deeply entrenched in a medieval past.
It's like he's the creator standing at the absolute dawn of a new world, while his mind remains entirely occupied with the architecture of the old one.
Which is a beautiful way to put it, and that orientation creates a really fascinating lens through which to view the composers who followed him.
Especially the sharp contrast the text draws between Beethoven and Mozart. I have to admit, when I first read it, the book's characterization of Beethoven almost feels like a demotion.
A demotion? How so?
Well, we think of Beethoven as this thunderous, utterly original genius, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the text defines his work essentially as music about music. It paints him almost like a scavenger bee, wandering through the world, gathering very specific, already existing nectar. He takes a discarded melody from a street beggar, or a rough tune from a vagrant Italian, or, a rhythm from a chaotic village inn.
Or a carnival night.
Right? And he stores them away. He synthesizes them.
See, I don't think it is a demotion of his genius at all. I mean, rather, it's a clarification of his mechanism.
Okay, that's fair.
Beethoven's genius is alchemical. His inspiration is fundamentally auditory. It's synthesized from the sonic fragments of the world around him. He hears a piece of music, perhaps something trivial or long forgotten by the original player, and he transforms it.
Through this really emotional, almost agonizing meditation.
Exactly. He transforms it into a state of tonal innocence. He elevates the discarded into hallowed memories of a better world. Now, contrast that mechanism with Mozart.
Right, because Mozart finds his inspiration completely differently. Not in hearing old music, but in directly gazing at life.
Specifically, the stirring, vibrant life of southern lands. The book mentions how Mozart was constantly dreaming of Italy when he wasn't physically there.
His music is like the pure visual distillation of a sun-drenched, active existence.
It's a direct, vibrant translation of the pulse of a life he desperately longed to live, completely unmediated by the musical scraps of others.
So, just to summarize that, Beethoven processes the world through his ears, building a meditation on the past, while Mozart processed the world through his eyes, projecting a fantasy of the present.
That's a great way to synthesize it.
But if we're talking about how these masters process their constraints, we really have to look at what the book says about Chopin.
Oh, the concept of playing in fetters.
Yeah. It describes Chopin as playing and dancing in the fetters of melodic and rhythmic traditions. He was born under the absolute sway of etiquette, and rather than rebelling against it, he admitted the validity of these traditions. He never spurned the chain.
He embraced the limitation.
Right. And I was trying to map this onto a modern creative process, and it strikes me as being identical to, like, a contemporary poet choosing to write a strict Shakespearean sonnet.
Oh, that's a perfect analogy.
Because you are locked into exactly 14 lines, a rigid rhyme scheme, a specific meter. For a mediocre artist, those rules are a suffocating prison. But for a master, that extreme limitation is the only thing that can force the highest, most concentrated form of creative freedom.
You are forced to dance within the chains.
Exactly.
And the book specifically categorizes this as princely freedom. Chopin uses the simplest, most rigid traditional structures the way a great painter like Raphael uses the most basic traditional palette of colors.
It's not about breaking the rules to be free.
No, not at all. True freedom, in the context of high art, isn't the total absence of rules. It is not throwing buckets of paint at a canvas or abandoning all musical meter in some chaotic rebellion. It is the ability to be the freest, daintiest, most transcendent spirit while entirely bound by relentless convention. By accepting the fetters, Chopin achieves a grace that pure, structureless chaos could never even approach.
You only truly understand the power of the dancer when when you see how heavy the chains are that they are making float.
Exactly. Beautifully said.
But, you know, there is a massive friction here. If true artistic mastery requires these rigid, aristocratic fetters, look at what happens when you drop that concept of art into our current era.
An era the book defines as an industrious epoch.
Yes, we have transitioned into a society where relentless work, productivity, and sheer efficiency have become the ultimate conscience of humanity. We just don't have room for princely freedom anymore.
Because art itself has been demoted.
Precisely. It has been stripped of its sovereignty and relegated to mere leisure. It's just a simple, easily digestible recreation meant only to fill the tiny, exhausted residue of our time and strength after the workday is finally done.
And this is perhaps one of the most vital transitions in the text's entire philosophical framework. Because we live in a machine age that demands all our prime waking energy for industrial output, the very biological nature of what art must do to reach us has fundamentally mutated.
The audience has changed, so the art has to change.
Exactly. Consider the nervous system of the modern worker. You are completely exhausted, drained by the dovetailed machinery of the industrious life. If a piece of truly great art that requires patience, stillness, and a fresh mind were to approach you gently, you wouldn't even possess the sensory bandwidth to register it.
You're just too tired to care.
Right. Therefore, modern art is forced to use powerful excitants from its medicine chest. It must act as a narcotic.
A narcotic? Wow.
Yes, it has to deafen you, intoxicate you, or bring you to violent unearned tears just to stimulate your deadened nervous system for one single evening.
Think about how perfectly that explains our modern consumption of entertainment. Picture coming home after a grueling 10-hour shift, staring at spreadsheets or managing crises.
You are barely functioning?
Right. You do not reach for a subtle, quiet, meditative piece of literature, nor do you put on a complex, nuanced symphony. You want the cinematic equivalent of a loud, sugary energy drink.
You need a jolt.
Yeah, you want the most explosive, visually overwhelming, high-stakes, hyper-dramatic media available. Your system is so numb that it requires a sledgehammer just to feel anything other than raw fatigue.
But the Times is clear that truly great art absolutely despises this dynamic. Great art refuses to act as a cunning courtesan, offering a quick, intense distraction.
It demands an audience that is awake.
Awake, expectant, and vigorous. It wants to live in the pure, calm element of a fresh morning soul, not the exhausted dregs of the night.
Which brings us to the profound psychological danger of what the book calls cheerful music when it's played for this exhausted modern audience.
Yes, this part is fascinating.
If you've been starved of genuine artistic connection for a long time, and suddenly you're exposed to a cheerful, upbeat, wildly gay tune, the text argues it hits your bloodstream like a heavy, unwatered southern wine.
It doesn't simply make you happy.
No. The physiological reaction is far darker. It leaves you dazed, longing for sleep, and filled with a paradoxical, agonizing mix of bitterness, pain, and homesickness. It is like sipping a sweetened draught of poison.
And why does joy cause pain in that moment? It's the sheer brutality of the contrast.
Exactly.
The gay, noisy merriment of the music highlights the devastating reality of your own internal exhaustion. The room you are sitting in suddenly feels overwhelmingly narrow and brown.
You are forced into the perspective of a wretched, chained prisoner.
Yes, a prisoner who suddenly hears the vibrant, carefree sounds of a festival taking place just outside their window. The music doesn't free you, it only sharpens the absolute agony of your own confinement.
And that underlying, inescapable agony is the direct product of the civilization of machinery.
The machine age is a masterclass in centralization. It brilliantly teaches the dovetailed, synchronized working of massive groups of people.
Unlocking immense, dormant forces of production.
Right, but it completely fails to teach the one thing necessary for a fulfilled human spirit, which is individual self-glorification. You are trained to view yourself merely as a tiny, interchangeable tool engineered for a single systemic purpose.
And the psychic result of that erasure of the individual is a despairing ennui, a profound, hollow boredom in the soul that makes us hanker so desperately for those artistic narcotics we just outlined.
It's a vicious cycle.
It really is. Now, if the industrial age has completely exhausted the body and reduced art to a narcotic, we have to examine how it has industrialized the mind itself.
The factory of knowledge.
Yes. The book introduces an incredibly sharp, almost brutal division within the realm of knowledge, separating what it calls the employees of science from the true philosophers.
The employees are the highly efficient, wildly successful scholars of our age.
They have a full memory, they practice their acumen meticulously, they acquire an incredibly sure hand and eye, they survey the massive landscape of human knowledge, they spot a tiny gap, like a missing brick in the grand wall of science, and they willingly place themselves right there to fill it.
They are useful, highly optimized tools,
They exist entirely for the sake of science.
and they are fundamentally opposed to the true philosophers. The text describes true philosophers as exceedingly rare, often deeply unpleasant, conceited, or cross-grained prodigies.
They don't sound very fun to be around.
No, they don't, but their defining characteristic is a total inversion of the employee's worldview. They do not exist for the sake of science. In their minds, science exists entirely for their sake.
Oh, wow. That's a massive shift.
It is. They flatly refuse to be utilized as tools to plug a gap in someone else's structural wall. Instead, they gather all this knowledge, all these established cold facts that the employees have so diligently mined, and they melt it down to mold it into a living, personal complexity.
They must build their own philosophical nest.
Exactly. If they are prevented from building their own unique atmospheric ecosystem of thought, the text states they will actually wilt away and perish like shelterless birds. They simply cannot breathe the sterile air of the impersonal factory of knowledge.
I want to focus on what happens to those brilliant minds who try to force themselves to breathe that sterile air, because the book's concept of the danger of savants is one of the most terrifying psychological breakdowns I have ever read.
It really is tragic.
Picture a young, brilliant mind starting out in their 20s with massive, spacious, world-altering hopes. They are described like a maritime discoverer setting sail, seeing a completely new, uncharted shore dawning in the far distance.
They possess daring tasks and a boundless, sweeping imagination.
But then, the cold realities of the scientific and academic industry set in.
And the mechanism of their downfall is practically invisible to them as exist.
Right. They slowly realize that to actually accomplish anything recognized as valid by the institution, to avoid wasting force or accidentally repeating the unpublished work of others, they must severely limit their individual scope.
They must specialize.
Yes, specialize. As they learn this highly praised art of specialization, they acquire a manufactured disgust for half-soluble mysteries. They systematically begin to set aside everything that is grand, everything that is incomplete, sprawling, or indefinite.
Their youthful, world-spanning plans simply crumble away before their eyes, replaced by microscopic certainty.
But wait, modern society would argue that this is just maturity, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
We would say that giving up childish, sprawling dreams to do focused, practical work is exactly how progress is made. We need specialists.
Sure, we do. But the book argues that while it might be practical for the system, it is absolutely fatal for the soul of the individual. Because what is left of that grand maritime discoverer?
Scarcely anything but a few little knots.
Exactly. The master savant spends their old age taking a pathetic pleasure in untying tiny, insignificant knots of knowledge. And then the true psychological horror sets in.
The realization.
Yes. In the midst of this restless, highly praised, useful activity, the aging savant is suddenly overcome by a deep misgiving, a quiet torment of conscience.
They wake up one day and realize they have been transformed into what the text devastatingly calls a dexterous dwarf.
The dexterous dwarf, what an image!
They look at their absolute, undisputed mastery of these tiny microscopic matters, and a terrifying question finally pierces their defenses. Was all of this highly rewarded specialization actually just a convenience?
Was this intense, focused labor merely a coward's escape from the terrifying summons to true greatness?
They realize they shrank themselves to survive the machinery, but by the time they realize they have diminished themselves, the tragic punchline is delivered. They cannot pass beyond it anymore.
The time for greatness has permanently passed them by.
And that instinct to shrink oneself to fit the machinery isn't just confined to the sciences, is it? It is the fundamental architecture of human society. It leads directly to the text's radical deconstruction of how we interact with each other.
Yes, the concept of social masks.
It posits this striking, almost counterintuitive idea. Mediocrity is the happiest mask which the superior mind can wear. And what is so fascinating is the motivation behind it. It is not worn out of malice or deception or a desire to manipulate.
It is worn out of pity.
Exactly. The superior mind deliberately puts on the mask of mediocrity so as not to irritate the great majority of people, to actively avoid making the mediocre feel the crushing weight of their own inadequacy.
It is an act of supreme self-erasing kindness that ultimately destroys the wearer. But to understand why we rely so heavily on these social masks, The book forces us to dig into the primitive, highly functional roots of our behaviors. Take vanity, for example.
Right, because in the modern era, we view vanity as a petty, embarrassing character flaw, someone obsessing over their reflection or curating a flawless image.
But the text drags us back to primitive times to examine its actual mechanics. Imagine a strong, dominant individual who lives entirely by rapine, alternating violently between starvation and superfluity.
A very brutal existence.
Very. This individual quickly observes a brutal, fundamental truth of prehistoric survival. He stands or falls not by what his power actually is, but by what his power is thought to be.
It is basically a prehistoric PR campaign for sheer survival.
Exactly.
And if I struggle to see how vanity equates to staying alive, I just have to look at the math of perceived power. If my enemies firmly believe I am infinitely powerful and utterly ruthless, they won't attack me.
The accretion of fear you generate in their minds acts as an actual accretion of physical power for you.
Therefore, I will seek by every theatrical means possible to increase their faith in my power. That is the origin of vanity.
It is the greatest utility, the absolute strongest means of self-preservation in an unforgiving world.
Because it is infinitely easier and way less dangerous to increase the belief in your power than to actually engage in bloody combat to prove it.
Right. We only know vanity today in its weakened, emasculated, cosmetic form. But originally, it was a vital strategic tool utilized by the cleverest individuals to avoid death.
And if vanity is merely a practical survival tool stripped of its original context, the book applies this exact same ruthless logic to the virtues we cherish most deeply.
The invention of disinterestedness.
Yes. The text provides an incredibly vivid breakdown of how this virtue was literally invented. Picture this. Two neighboring chieftains are stuck in a long-standing, bloody, entirely indecisive feud.
They're burning each other's houses, stealing each other's cattle.
Completely locked in the mutually assured destruction. Then a third neighbor, who lives further away, decides to step in. He publicly acts as a mediator with grand ceremonial goodwill.
But secretly, he informs each chieftain that if they break the peace, he will immediately join forces with the other side and utterly annihilate them.
So let's map out the mechanics of this, because it is entirely selfish. It is a calculated, self-preserving political maneuver. The mediator simply doesn't want the chaos of war bleeding over his borders, and he doesn't want either chieftain gaining a decisive, threatening advantage.
So he forces a stalemate.
Right. But look at the optical illusion it creates for the two combatants. Suddenly, they are no longer bleeding out. Their prosperity skyrockets overnight. They are trading, they're farming, their foreheads lose their wrinkles, and they finally feel confidence in the future.
And every year, they meet in front of this mediator.
Here's the glitch in human perception. Because the combatants have profited so massively, and because the mediator's wealth hasn't visibly spiked in the same dramatic way, they begin to revere him.
They are so completely blinded by the blinding light of their own newfound happiness that they assume the mediator must not have had any personal profit in view.
They look at his forced peace and label his action disinterested.
And the text marks this as the exact, precise moment a functional moral quality is formally recognized as a virtue. When a highly practical, deeply selfish action visibly decides the happiness and destiny of a whole society, the society takes that action, isolates it, gives it a holy name, brings literal offerings to it, and demands the poets give it a divine pedigree.
A strategic, diplomatic survival move is frozen into marble, deified, and worshipped as the absolute, pure entity of disinterestedness.
It's incredible.
But wait, does this mean the moral abstractions we base our lives on are essentially imported tools that have entirely forgotten their own origins?
Yes. And the book scales this up to the level of national identity, exposing how entire nations launder borrowed traits into inherent virtues.
Like the concept of German virtue.
Exactly. In the late 18th century, there was a massive, undeniable moral awakening in Europe. Germany felt this novel, surging impulse towards seriousness, depth, and rigorous self-control.
And they felt such overwhelming astonishment at their own newfound virtue that they immediately launched the concept of German virtue into the world, aggressively acting as if it were their original hereditary biological possession.
But the text completely strips away that historical illusion. It points out that this supposedly original, deeply indigenous German virtue was actually nothing more than a direct inheritance.
From who?
The French. Specifically, the mythological influence of Rousseau, combined with the resurrected, austere, stoic spirit of ancient Rome.
So they just took it.
The Germans simply took this French impulse, transfused it directly into their own cultural bloodstream, completely forgot their gratitude to the source, and proudly claimed it as an indigenous phenomenon.
It is just another mass.
Yes, it is another macro-level historical illusion where a foreign tool is imported, rebranded, and then blindly worshipped as inherent truth.
So, if we accept this absolute deconstruction, if the society we live in is built on these functional illusions, if our highest virtues are just rebranded political tools, if nations are wearing masks of borrowed morality, and if our greatest scientific minds are willingly reducing themselves to dexterous dwarfs just to survive the machinery.
It's a lot to take in.
It is. How does a true thinker, a genuinely superior mind, actually navigate this world?
The book's answer is a survival strategy it calls shutting the mind's eyes.
Shutting the mind's eyes.
If you want to interact with average, decorous, friendly people without destroying them or yourself, you must consciously, deliberately, and constantly obscure your own mental vision.
The nautical analogy the text uses perfectly captures the peril of the thinker here. It states that the ship of your thoughts simply goes far too deep. Its draft is enormous.
Right. If you attempt to navigate the shallow, pleasant waters of friendly, everyday society with your true depth of thought engaged, you are going to violently run aground on their sandbanks at every turn.
You will be continuously tacking, turning, and awkwardly reversing, utterly perplexed by their shallowness. And you will leave everyone around you equally perplexed, though they will lack the capacity to even divine the reason why the conversation feels so violently uncomfortable.
So you have no choice but to pull up the anchor of your intellect entirely just to float harmlessly in their waters.
And this strategy of intentional obscuration transforms the very nature of human interaction. The book observes that most average people engage in conversation, like two ships sailing side by side, constantly and clumsily bumping into each other, with each ship firmly convinced that it is the one leading and towing the other.
They are not really listening. They are merely waiting for their turn to speak, paying attention only to the sound of their own incoming thoughts.
But the true thinker, the one who has violently shut their mind's eyes, operates completely differently. They act as what the book terrifyingly calls a listener in ambush.
A listener in ambush. They offer polite, entirely provisional answers, utilizing words merely as a temporary payment on account of politeness.
But silently, their memory is lurking.
Yes. They are meticulously memorizing everything the other person says, categorizing their unconscious tones, observing the nervous twitches of their gestures. They are gathering massive amounts of psychological data while appearing completely benign and agreeable.
It is intellectual reconnaissance.
Exactly. And if they ever need to act on that meticulously gathered data, if they are ever forced to strike back, the text has a very specific, chilling definition of what constitutes the ultimate, most terrible revenge.
It has nothing to do with wrath, right? Sudden, explosive anger and immediate physical punishment, the book notes, are simply our pathetic inheritance from the animals.
True, terrible, uniquely human revenge requires immense cold patience. You must wait, sometimes for years, until you have your hand absolutely full of pure truths and equities.
You don't use slander. You don't use lies.
No, you use the unvarnished, devastating reality you have gathered while waiting silently in ambush. The text uses the historical example of Voltaire taking revenge on Pyrrhon.
Voltaire didn't scream or challenge him to a duel. He simply summarized Pyrrhon's entire life, his entire body of work, and the absolute core of his character in 5 devastating, brilliantly crafted lines, where every single word was an undeniable, absolute truth.
It is terrible precisely because it is the exercise of pure, unfiltered equity. When you are struck with a lie, you can defend yourself. You can appeal to the truth.
But when you are struck with pure truth, there is no higher court to which the victim can appeal. The reality of their own existence becomes their absolute destruction.
But the text forces us to look at the darkest possible application of this pure truth. What happens when that pure truth isn't weaponized against an enemy?
Right. What happens when the thinker turns that pure truth inward, applies it entirely to themselves, undergoes a massive foundational internal revolution, and then attempts to share that pure truth with the world?
This is the final, deeply agonizing thought the book leaves you to wrestle with.
Imagine someone, perhaps you, undergoes a thorough, profoundly painful transformation as a thinker and as a human being. You systematically shed all your old illusions, you rip away the masks of vanity and imported virtue, you completely alter the deepest foundations of your soul. You are reborn.
And out of a sense of duty or desperate connection, You make a public avowal of this profound change.
You stand before your peers, your friends, your society, and you articulate your new, hard-won reality. And yet the people who hear you see absolutely nothing.
The people standing right in front of you still firmly believe you are the exact same person you were the day before.
This horrifying realization that the world is fundamentally biologically incapable of perceiving true intellectual and spiritual transformation creates what the text calls the silence of disgust, forcing the thinker to realize once and for all with crushing finality that they have rated the intellect of mankind far, far too highly. So imagine, just for a moment, that you are forced to spend your entire existence inside this deafening, dust-choked construction site.
Right, just endless noise and heavy labor.
Exactly. You break your back hauling stones and pouring cement to build a massive, impenetrable wall. And this wall is protecting a beautiful, tranquil garden, but you will never, ever be allowed to step foot inside that garden yourself.
It is a remarkably bleak image.
It really is. And that brutal psychological toll is exactly how we must view the democratization of modern society when we examine the architectural metaphors laid out in the book. It doesn't present democratic progress as some, joyous arrival at a utopian finish line. Rather, it's a grueling, centuries-long era of laying massive stone foundations.
Yeah, the book actually calls it an age of cyclopean building.
Cyclopean.
Like those ancient, massive, irregular stone walls. It's defined by heavy masonry and brutal dams. There's really no celebration in this phase of human history, only profound, relentless labor.
And it forces a profoundly sobering visualization of societal progress. I mean, we really have to ask why this heavy masonry is necessary at all.
Well, the text meticulously breaks down why this labor is a prophylactic measure. These democratic walls are not being built for their own aesthetic glory, They are strictly defensive structures.
Defensive against what, exactly?
They are engineered to protect the distant future from what the text calls the mountain torrents of barbaric plagues, and, crucially, from spiritual serfdom.
Wow.
But we have to consider the underlying mechanics of what this actually does to the human mind. The laborers of today are described as having gray dust wafted into their very brains.
Gray dust in their brains. That's such a visceral way to put it.
It is, because the work of building democratic infrastructure is so monotonous, so intellectually dulling, the workers fall into a sort of teleological trap.
A teleological trap, meaning they completely confuse the means with the ultimate end. Because they've spent their whole lives surrounded by scaffolding and cement mixers, they mistakenly believe the stone wall itself is the final goal of human existence.
Yeah, they simply cannot conceive of the silence of a finished room.
Right. It suggests that the people fighting for foundational democratic principles are actively sacrificing their own intellectual refinement. They endure this gray dust so that a future horticulturalist of the human spirit can safely plant an orchard behind the walls they built.
That's the tragedy of it, yes.
But I have to wonder if we look at the entire scope of the book's philosophy. Does this mean the nation-state as we know it is just temporary scaffolding?
That is really the inevitable conclusion here. If we trace this foundational labor to its logical endpoint, we arrive at a radical prediction for the macrostructure of the future.
Which is?
The text foresees the eventual dissolution of individual nation-states. It envisions a European League of Nations where borders are no longer violently contested lines drawn in human blood.
Right, they become something else entirely.
Exactly, they become mere administrative boundaries. But the mechanism of this change is fascinating. The diplomats drawing these lines cannot be diplomats in the traditional Machiavellian sense.
They have to be different.
Right. They must function as students of civilization. They operate as agriculturists and commercial experts rather than, military commanders with armies at their backs.
So the historical patriotic memories that once fueled territorial wars, those just fade away.
More than fade, they must be deliberately, systematically uprooted to serve the whole federation.
But building this massive macro-level democratic federation requires managing the millions of individual stones, meaning the current volatile nation-states.
Right, the transitional phase.
Exactly. And this brings us to a terrifying paradox regarding how these societies interact right now. The book takes an incredibly provocative stance on the concept of standing armies and the illusion of self-defense.
It really flips the conventional wisdom on its head.
It does.
Yeah.
We naturally assume that maintaining an army purely for defense is a morally neutral, maybe even righteous act.
Sure, just protecting your own yard.
But the text argues that the very act of claiming your army is defensive is inherently a staggering accusation against your neighboring countries.
It's a brilliant psychological dissection of geopolitics. By arming yourself and loudly claiming it is strictly for self-defense, you are explicitly declaring that your neighbor is immoral, aggressive, and eager for conquests.
Right, you're pointing a finger.
Exactly. You are framing them, by your very defensive posture, as a cunning criminal waiting for a moment of weakness. This defensive stance is itself a provocation worse than actual war,
Wow, worse than war.
because it creates a paradigm where all states face each other assuming pure, righteous intentions from themselves and inherently evil intentions from their neighbors.
So this armed peace we live under.
It isn't a triumph of diplomacy at all. It is diagnosed as a symptom of profound hate and paralyzing fear.
I have to push back on the proposed solution, though, because it borders on the unthinkable.
It is radical, yes.
The text argues that the only way to achieve genuine peace is for a powerful, victorious, heavily armed nation to voluntarily break its swords. I mean, in reality, isn't that just geopolitical suicide?
Oh, well.
How does the philosophy justify a nation making itself entirely defenseless against neighbors who might actually be aggressive?
It's a fair question, but it requires us to completely abandon our modern calculus of deterrence. The text is absolute in its assertion that true peace cannot be negotiated through a balance of terror or a gradual reciprocal reduction of weapons.
There's no treaties.
No treaties. It requires a profound, almost divine loftiness of sentiment. A nation must willingly become defenseless because it must declare that it is fundamentally better to perish than to hate and fear.
Better to perish than to hate and fear.
And twice as far better to perish than to make oneself hated and feared. It is a total rejection of the armed peace.
So it demands a single stroke of lightning to destroy the tree of military glory entirely, knowing full well the physical risks involved.
Exactly. The spiritual victory supersedes physical survival.
So moving from the macro labor of the military machine, we see this exact same destruction of the spirit mirrored in the micro labor of the individual in the industrial machine.
Yes, the parallels are striking.
The book makes a poignant observation about how machinery robs work of its humanity. Think about the difference between an artisan who spends weeks carving a single heirloom dining chair.
Pouring their soul into it.
Right, pouring their eccentricities, their distinct soul, and even their physical defects into the wood compared to a factory stamping out thousands of anonymous, identical plastic stools.
It's a completely different relationship to creation.
We are living in a state of anonymous serfdom, trading the soul of the craftsman for the mere facilitation of mass labor.
And that loss of the craftsman's soul fundamentally alters how we must evaluate labor itself. We are so accustomed to judging the value of a person's work morally, right? Praising their industry, their time, or their dedication.
Yeah, the Protestant work ethic sort of thing.
Exactly. But the book insists this is a fallacy. We cannot evaluate labor morally because the worker is not truly free.
Wait, not free how?
You do not decide whether you work or truly how you work. You are driven by a necessary concatenation of forces, biological needs, and systemic pressures.
You have to eat.
Right. Therefore, throwing the worker's good or bad will into a moral scale is impossible. The mechanism of choice has been completely removed by the system.
Okay, but if we strip away the moral judgment of labor entirely, then what happens to the concept of justice that workers constantly demand? I mean, if a factory owner pays a living wage and provides safe conditions, we usually call that moral justice.
But the text argues it is nothing of the sort. What we currently call justice in the realm of labor is merely a highly refined, long-term utility.
Utility.
Yes, it's a systemic biological calculation designed to keep the societal machine running smoothly, not just for today, but for future generations.
So it's not about being good, it's about being efficient.
Think about how this actually works in practice. If a massive corporation pays a worker just enough to keep them fed, healthy, and slightly entertained, that isn't moral justice. It is maintenance.
Like oiling a machine.
Exactly. Treating workers well is simply the most mathematically efficient way to ensure they and their posterity remain trustworthy and productive.
So exploitation is what then?
Exploitation, therefore, is criticized not as a moral sin, but as a piece of gross systemic folly. It is a short-sighted robbery at the expense of the future workforce.
That is fascinating. Let's move away from the external timelines of geopolitics and industrial utility and look inward at the deeply intimate architecture of a single human lifespan.
The internal timeline.
Right, because how we construct our own internal timelines dictates how we perceive this labor. We have to dismantle the venerable, cliched myth of the 4 seasons of life.
Oh, this part of the text is so compelling.
It is. Consider how often we map youth to spring and old age to winter. The text argues that this is a completely superficial analogy based on nothing more than comparing white hair to snow.
Just surface-level poetry.
Exactly. Instead, it radically redefines the timeline of human maturation. The first 20 years of your life are not a season at all. They are an extended period of preparation, a long, drawn-out New Year's Day. The true seasons of life, the periods of profound internal change, exist exclusively in the narrow interval between the ages of 20 and 50.
And the psychological accuracy of these redefined seasons is just startling. The 20s are not the joyful spring of youth. They are the hot, impetuous, exhausting summer.
I think anyone who's lived through their 20s can agree with that.
Right. They are oppressive, stormy years where the sheer labor of establishing oneself seems cruel but necessary. It is a time when you only praise the day in the evening as you wipe the sweat from your forehead.
And then come the 30s.
Then come the 30s. This is the true spring, ever restless, stimulating, filled with bubbling sap, the bloom of leaves and the fragrance of buds. It is a time of joyful robustness, strengthened by the distinct savor of hopeful anticipation.
Which brings us to the 40s.
Yes, the 40s. The text paints the 40s as the mysterious, clear, broad plateau of autumn. It is the time of harvest, traversed by a fresh breeze beneath a cloudless sky, maintaining a gentle, stationary look all day and half the night.
Think about your own life right now as you listen to this. If you are standing on that clear, broad plateau of your 40s, the book introduces a profound temporal concept that occurs here at noontide.
At noontide, yes.
This is the pinnacle moment in an active, perhaps historically stormy life, when a strange, heavy, almost overwhelming happiness descends upon you.
It's a very specific feeling being described.
It is. The soul, having spent its morning in furious, restless activity, longs for a rest that might last for months or years. The text uses a masterfully evocative image, seeing the great god Pan sleeping in a hidden woodland sward.
Where all of nature seems to fall asleep.
Exactly, with an expression of eternity on its face. It is described as a death with waking eyes.
That phrase, a death with waking eyes, captures the exact mechanism of this state. In this noontide, the suspension of desire is absolute. You want nothing, you trouble about nothing.
The heart stands still, only the eye lives.
Right. The world is woven into and buried within a net of light. The individual is entirely free for that suspended moment from the relentless retinue of life, from the illusion of progress, from enjoyment, destruction, and decay.
It sounds incredibly peaceful.
It is the ultimate state of passive, crystalline cognition. It is a necessary stillness before the wind stirs the trees again, and the even more active, stormy evening of life carries you away.
So, having reached this autumnal plateau, having experienced the crystalline cognition of noontide, how do you handle your own mind? How do you engage with your own inner truths?
Well, the text makes an incredibly piercing psychological observation about our intellectual vanity.
Yes, the bowler metaphor.
Right. When we are arguing a point and suddenly realize our underlying logic is weak, we frantically try to improve that argument by adding our personality, our passion, and wild gestures to it.
Hoping the volume will make up for the logic.
We hope the sheer force of our physical conviction will make it hit the mark. The text compares it to a bowler who releases the ball down the lane, realizes it is drifting into the gutter, and violently twists their own body in the air, absurdly trying to steer a ball that has already left their hand.
It's such a funny, perfect image. We contort ourselves because we are desperately attached to our own intellectual outputs.
We are, and this brings us to a profound exploration of intellectual freedom. The text warns against the martyrdom of certainty.
Meaning?
It argues we should never allow ourselves to be burned at the stake for our opinions, primarily because, fundamentally, we cannot be truly certain of them. Human cognition is too flawed.
So we shouldn't die for what we believe.
Instead, if we are to be martyrs at all, we should be willing to be burned for the right to change our opinions.
The right to change. That's a huge distinction. It's the difference between someone actively researching a complex topic every single day versus someone who memorized a talking point 10 years ago, locked it in a mental filing cabinet, and violently refuses to ever update it.
Exactly. And the text contrasts these two states beautifully. It compares live opinions to live fish.
Live fish.
If you want a live fish, you cannot just buy it once and keep it on a shelf, right? You must actively go out to the river and catch it every single day. Truth is an active daily pursuit.
And the alternative.
The alternative is being content with a cabinet of fossils, what the book calls convictions. Dead, petrified thoughts stored in the mind, unchanging and lifeless.
But I do struggle with the book's concept of the disease of chains in this context.
How so?
Well, the text explicitly states that morality, religion, and metaphysical ideas were necessary chains. They were the required constraints to separate early man from the brute animal.
Yes, that's correct.
If they were so vital for our evolution, why the sudden, urgent insistence that these chains must now be violently removed?
Because the utility of the scaffolding expires once the building can stand on its own. The text argues that man has been bound with these chains for so long, specifically to force him to become gentle, intellectual, and meditative.
Oh.
But now, the ennobled man has carried these heavy chains for such an extended historical period that he has literally forgotten what pure air and free movement feel like. He suffers from a disease of constraint.
So the chains did their job, but now they're suffocating us.
Exactly. The scaffolding was necessary to build the house of the human intellect. But now that the house is built, the scaffolding itself becomes a dangerous obstruction to further growth.
But you can't just tear it down for everyone all at once, can you?
No, true freedom of spirit cannot simply be handed to the masses. The true thinker requires profound solitude, demanding at least a third of the day completely away from men, passions, and books.
Solitude to finally learn how to surprise oneself. The text suggests we must approach our own minds torch in hand.
Torch in hand, yes.
We are so deeply accustomed to looking at our curated, flattering reflection in the mirror of society that we completely forget our own unalterable truths. We forget our own intellectual ugliness.
We hide it from ourselves.
Right. We need the shock of the torchlight in the dark to actually see our true, unvarnished reflection.
And this solitary pursuit of unvarnished truth brings us to the culmination of this entire philosophical architecture. The ultimate destination of the ennobled mind is depicted in a hauntingly beautiful final dialogue between a wanderer and his shadow.
It's an incredible scene. The setting has this intense, quiet atmosphere. The sun is sinking toward the mountains, the shadows are lengthening, and the grass is growing damp in the evening air.
You can really picture it.
And the wanderer is speaking directly with his own shadow. Now, in this philosophical construct, the shadow represents the silent, patient, deeply observant side of the self. It is the part of us that only accompanies us when we are walking in the light of knowledge, the part that inherently knows how to be silent and wait.
Yes, and the shadow harbors a pure epistemic thirst, a fundamental, consuming craving for ultimate truth and complete knowledge of man.
But it's limited, right?
It is. Because the shadow is bound to the light, it cannot follow man into the dark recesses of his life. Much of human nature remains obscure to it. Driven by this desperate need to know, the shadow offers the ultimate sacrifice.
Which is?
At the price of complete knowledge, it offers to become the wanderer's willing slave.
But the wanderer vehemently, almost violently, refuses the offer.
Because to accept it would destroy the very freedom he has spent his entire life cultivating. The wanderer rejects all forms of slavery and domination.
He questions the whole dynamic.
Exactly. He questions the mechanics of this subjugation. Might the shadow unwittingly become the master through its subservience? Or if it remained a slave, would it lead a life of disgust, secretly despising the very master it serves?
He won't have any part of it.
The wanderer declares that he will not tolerate any slaves about him. He refuses to command even a dog, dismissing the animal as a lazy, tail-wagging parasite merely because it represents subservience.
That's uncompromising.
For the wanderer, the sight of any unfree being would completely embitter his greatest joys. It is the ultimate, uncompromising declaration of absolute intellectual independence. He demands that both he and his shadow remain entirely free, walking together not as master and servant, but as independent, parallel entities.
And so, the imagery wraps up in this quiet twilight. The shadow blushes its only color, a deepening dark, feeling the damp chill of the evening grass. It makes one final, incredibly simple request to the wanderer to simply move a little out of the light as they walk toward the sinking sun behind the fir trees and the mountains. But as the shadow fades into the damp grass and the ennobled individual finally stands completely free from both society's chains and their own internal masters, this silence isn't an end, but a threshold. If we have truly learned to sit quietly with our own shadow at this exact point, we are forced to deeply consider what new horizons this liberated spirit must conquer next. Right, moving immediately on to.